When the world remembers World War II, it often recalls the thunder of tanks, the clash of empires, and the rise and fall of nations. But beyond the smoke and medals, there existed a darker, quieter battlefield, one without gunfire, without glory, where survival itself became a slow, painful war. Behind barbed wire and watchtowers, millions of captured souls endured starvation, disease, and the slow erosion of their humanity. These were not soldiers anymore, but shadows, living in a place where hope decayed faster than flesh, and the sun itself seemed ashamed to rise. Tonight, we step beyond the front lines, into the hidden hell of POW camps, where every breath was a victory, and every heartbeat defied extinction. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Under a sky thick with drifting ash, the world seemed to hold its breath. The roar of artillery had stopped, but its echo lingered somewhere deep inside the earth, a low hum beneath the broken fields. The soil, churned and blackened, still trembled faintly from what had passed, the great convulsion of metal and fire that had consumed the land for years. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was the uneasy quiet of exhaustion, of something immense collapsing under its own weight. Across Europe and Asia, from the frozen plains of Russia to the humid jungles of Burma, men stood amid ruins, their weapons slack in their hands, their faces streaked with mud and disbelief. The battles had ended, but the war had not truly released them. Smoke rose from shattered tanks and the skeletons of villages. The air smelled of cordite, sweat, and distant burning, the residue of a world undone. The fields were strewn with bodies and the wreckage of dreams. And among the survivors, the captured moved slowly, almost dazed, unsure if they had been spared or condemned. For them, the end of gunfire did not mean freedom. It meant surrender and the uncertain fate that followed. The victors moved among the defeated with measured caution. Orders were barked, rifles gestured toward gathering points. The prisoners, their limbs stiff with fatigue, obeyed without thought. Many had not eaten in days. Others carried wounds crusted in dirt. Some walked barefoot through fields littered with the fragments of their comrades. There was no defiance left, only the dull instinct to keep moving. The sky above was colorless, an indifferent gray, neither dawn nor dusk, as though time itself hesitated to continue. Along the roads, columns of soldiers were herded together, hundreds, sometimes thousands, stretching toward horizons that promised no end. Their uniforms hung in tatters, the insignias of nations were now meaningless decorations. A soldier from one side could glance at a soldier from the other and see no difference, only the same hollow stare, the same sagging shoulders, the same disbelief that this was what survival had become. War had reduced them to shadows of intent. Once they had charged with purpose, with banners, with belief. Now they were simply men, nameless, reduced to breath and bone, moving under guard towards something they could not yet imagine. The sound of boots crunching in the dirt replaced the sound of explosions. Occasionally, a cough or a groan broke through the silence, and then the column would resume its slow rhythm, a human tide flowing toward captivity. In some places, the fields were so devastated that the line between life and death blurred. Bodies lay twisted in unnatural positions, their faces already softening under the weight of dust. The living stepped over them carefully, almost reverently, though few had the strength to feel grief. Grief was a luxury for those who had time to remember. For the captured, each step forward was its own kind of forgetting. Officers and guards moved along the edges of the columns, their expressions carved from stone. Some were young, barely men themselves, hardened by orders rather than belief. Others had seen enough killing to find no satisfaction in victory. Their duty now was not to fight but to contain, to turn the chaos of war into the order of imprisonment. Behind them, the thunder of battle faded entirely, leaving only the sighing wind that whispered through the empty husks of buildings and trees, stripped bare by fire. In the cities too, the silence was heavy. Streets that had once echoed with marching boots now held only the scrape of shovels as civilians began to clear the rubble. Prisoners passed through these ruined towns on their way to the trains that would take them deeper into the unknown. Sometimes faces watched them from shattered windows, silent, expressionless faces of those who had lost too much to hate or pity. Children stood barefoot in doorways, their eyes following the convoys of defeated men. The prisoners themselves did not speak. Their language was now the universal one of exhaustion. A few tried to keep count of the days, but soon even that small measure of control slipped away. The march had no clear beginning and no visible end. Some were taken across fields that had been fought over a dozen times. Others were led into forests where the light barely reached the ground. At night they lay in open spaces under the indifferent stars, surrounded by guards who smoked silently, their eyes reflecting the dim glow of their cigarettes. When the first camps appeared, they did not look like places built for men. Fences of rusted wire, guard towers leaning like skeletal sentinels, long wooden huts lined in rows, the architecture of containment. The gates creaked open and swallowed them without ceremony. Names were written down, ranks noted, possessions taken, watches, rings, letters, even photographs were stripped away. What could not be confiscated was still taken by time, the sense of self, the fragile illusion of dignity. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old wood and damp earth. The floors creaked with every hesitant step. In some camps the walls were painted with flaking whitewash, in others they were bare, scarred by years of neglect. The men sat in silence, listening to the distant barking of dogs and the rhythmic pacing of guards. They had not yet seen the full weight of captivity, but they felt its shape already, a slow, invisible pressure pressing in from every direction. For many, the first night was the hardest. The quiet was deeper than the trenches had ever been. There were no explosions, no commands shouted over gunfire, only the muffled sounds of breathing, the shifting of bodies trying to find comfort on cold planks. Outside, the wind rattled the wire fences, a ghostly sound that seemed to whisper of places beyond reach. Some stared at the ceiling until dawn, others sank into a dreamless half-sleep, where the line between thought and oblivion dissolved. Morning came without light. Greyness seeped through the cracks of the barracks. The prisoners were called out for roll. The cold bit into their hands and faces. They stood motionless, waiting for their numbers to be counted, their existence confirmed. Beyond the fence, the world continued, indifferent. Trains rumbled somewhere far off. A crow circled overhead. Life persisted, but it was no longer theirs to live, and so began the true silence. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of freedom, of meaning, of all that had once defined them. It was in that silence that the war changed shape, becoming something colder and more intimate. The battlefield had moved inside the wire, and the fight for survival would now be waged without weapons, without movement, and without end. The march began without warning, as if it had been happening long before the men realized they were part of it. The guards shouted, their words indistinct, carried away by a wind that smelled faintly of smoke and blood. Rows of prisoners were assembled, lined shoulder to shoulder, their eyes hollow beneath their helmets. When the order came, they moved as one exhausted body, stumbling forward through the ruins of what had once been a town. Bricks crunched under their boots. Shattered glass sparkled faintly in the grey light, like frost clinging to the skeletons of windows. The air was heavy with the aftermath of destruction. Buildings stood roofless and half-burned, their walls open to the elements, like the ribs of great carcasses left behind by a storm. Somewhere, a church bell hung twisted and silent in its frame. Smoke drifted from the rubble in thin blue lines. Dogs barked in the distance, and the low moan of the wind moving through empty alleys gave the place a sound like breathing. It was not a landscape of victory or defeat, only one of exhaustion. The war had passed through here and left nothing human behind. The prisoners marched slowly, their feet dragging in the mud. Some carried wounded comrades over their shoulders. Others walked with their heads bent low, every movement measured by pain. They had been given no food, no rest, only the order to keep moving. Behind them, guards followed on horseback or trucks, rifles slung casually as though they were shepherding cattle. Every so often, one would shout for the column to quicken its pace, and a few stragglers would be forced to jog, stumbling to keep up. Those who fell too far behind were left where they dropped. No one dared to look back. As the hours stretched into days, the march became a rhythm, slow, monotonous, hypnotic. The prisoners' sense of time dissolved. Morning and night blurred together under the endless movement. Hunger settled in first as an ache, then as a constant hollow presence in the gut. When they passed through burned-out villages, some men tried to snatch food from the ground, a half-burned potato, a crust of bread too moldy to chew. Guards struck them with rifle butts, and the column moved on. The road ahead offered no mercy, only more distance. Rain began to fall on the third day, fine and cold. The mud deepened, clinging to their boots, sucking at their steps. The men's uniforms, already ragged, grew heavier with each mile. The sound of marching feet became dull and sticky, punctuated by coughs and the occasional groan. No one spoke. Words had become pointless, wasted breath. They communicated instead with glances, silent, brief exchanges that said, "Keep moving, don't fall, don't draw attention." The wounded suffered most. Some limped with makeshift crutches, others tied rags around bleeding wounds. Infection spread quickly, and the smell of rot mingled with the rain. Guards ignored the suffering. Occasionally, a shot would ring out from behind, quick and final. The column did not stop. The sound would fade, swallowed by the steady rhythm of the march. The living had learned not to count the missing. At night, they were herded into fields or barns to sleep. The ground was cold, the straw damp, the air thick with the odor of sweat and decay. The guards built fires for themselves and ate from tins while the prisoners watched in silence, their stomachs twisting. Some men muttered prayers under their breath. Others stared blankly into the dark, too tired to think. Sleep came in shallow bursts, broken by shivering and nightmares of gunfire. When morning arrived, it brought no relief, only the command to rise, to march again. The landscape changed as they moved. Forests replaced villages, rivers crossed the path like veins of dark glass. In the distance, hills rose and disappeared again under fog. Occasionally, they passed local civilians, farmers, widows, children, who watched the endless line of prisoners with cautious eyes. Some showed pity, offering small bits of bread or water when the guards looked away. Others turned their faces, unwilling to see what they could not change. In those moments, the prisoners felt the weight of invisibility, that they no longer belonged to the living world, that they had become ghosts moving through it. One evening, as the sun sank red behind the trees, the column reached a crossroads littered with abandoned carts and bodies. The guards called a halt. The prisoners sank to the ground, too weary to care about the mud soaking through their clothes. A few men tried to count the days since capture, but gave up. The numbers had stopped meaning anything. The war had fractured time. There was only the next step, the next breath, the next stretch of road. By the fifth day, the march began to claim its first lives. A man would collapse, unable to rise, and the line would move around him. Sometimes a guard fired a single shot. Sometimes they simply left the body for scavengers. The living no longer reacted. There was no ceremony, no farewell, only the dull acceptance that survival was now a matter of endurance, not luck or courage. The prisoners had ceased to be soldiers. They were becoming something else, creatures of hunger and repetition, beings who measured the world by distance and silence. The road wound through valleys and across broken bridges. Snow began to fall at first lightly, then thick enough to muffle sound. The column became a trail of grey shapes, moving through white. The world narrowed to breath and motion. Men wrapped their arms around themselves to keep warm, though their hands had long gone numb. The snow covered the bodies of those who fell, erasing them as though they had never been. When they finally reached the first holding camp, a crude enclosure of barbed wire and wooden posts, the prisoners felt nothing. Relief was beyond them. They had marched through the ruins of civilization and into the skeleton of something worse. Inside the fence, tents sagged under the weight of snow. Smoke from cooking fires hung low, refusing to rise. The guards counted heads, marking numbers in a book. Then they locked the gates behind the last man. The march had ended, but the movement inside their minds did not stop. Even as they sat or lay down, their bodies twitched, still caught in the rhythm of steps. They dreamed of walking, always walking, through mud, through snow, through endless silence. The path no longer led anywhere. It had become a circle, a closed world of repetition. In that stillness, something in them changed. They began to understand that the war was not finished. It had merely shifted shape. The battlefield was now the human body itself, starving, shivering, eroding under control. What they had endured on the road was only the first lesson, the initiation into the long, cruel patience of captivity. And as the gates clanged shut, the realization spread through them slowly, like cold through cloth. This was only the beginning. The camp appeared first as a smudge on the horizon, a low distortion in the grey afternoon light. At a distance it looked harmless, rows of wooden shapes, maybe barns, maybe storage sheds. But as the prisoners drew nearer, the details sharpened, and the illusion of ordinariness dissolved. The fences rose out of the mud, like scars across the land, their barbed wire catching what little light remained, glinting with cruel precision. The posts leaned slightly inward, as though the earth itself recoiled from them. Beyond the outer fence, a second, and then a third, mirrored its curve, rings of confinement, layered like the shells of a trap. The men stopped walking when ordered, too tired even to feel dread. Behind them, the march was already becoming memory. The endless road, the faceless guards, the sound of boots in mud. Ahead of them stood the next shape of captivity, smaller in space but infinite in its weight. The gates were opened by guards whose faces bore no trace of victory or hatred, only the dull professionalism of routine. Their uniforms were neat, their rifles clean. A few dogs strained against their leashes, snapping at the air. The column moved again. Boots scraped against the ground, the rhythm sluggish and uneven. As they passed through the gates, a smell hit them, sour, damp, unmistakably human. It was the scent of old wood, soaked with sweat and rain, of smoke and rotting straw, of bodies that had lived too long too close together. The air itself seemed thick, reluctant to move. Inside, the camp stretched wider than it had looked from the outside, a bleak geometry of fences, barracks and towers. Everything was arranged with precision, but nothing felt alive. Watchtowers punctuated the perimeter like punctuation marks in a grim sentence. In each one, a guard stood behind a mounted machine gun, his silhouette framed against the dull sky. The towers were built from dark timber that groaned in the wind. Every movement in the camp was visible from above, every prisoner a figure in an open field. Privacy, like freedom, was an idea that no longer belonged here. The prisoners were divided into groups. Names were taken down, numbers assigned, languages recorded when possible. It was an exercise in order, in the reduction of individuality into manageable form. Those who had been officers or specialists found themselves indistinguishable from privates. Medals and ranks were meaningless now, stripped away like badges from a discarded uniform. The guards spoke little, their commands reduced to gestures, a pointed rifle, a wave of the hand, a curt nod toward a line of waiting barracks. Inside those barracks, the light was dim, filtered through narrow slits cut near the roof. The walls were rough planks nailed hastily together, the floors covered in a thin scattering of straw that smelled of mildew. Rows of wooden bunks lined both sides, stacked 3 high. The boards creaked with every breath, every movement. Men climbed into the spaces assigned to them, sitting with their backs against the wall, their knees drawn up to their chests. The air was already heavy with the weight of many lungs, and though no one spoke, the silence itself became a sound, the collective exhale of hundreds of lives confined. When darkness fell, the camp took on a different shape. The fences glowed faintly under the pale bulbs strung along their length. Shadows of barbed wire stretched across the ground, moving gently in the wind. From the watchtowers, beams of light swept methodically over the compound, tracing every corner, every figure. Occasionally, a guard's voice barked an order or a warning, but mostly the night was filled with softer noises, the murmuring of men, the rustle of straw, the faint crackle of fires outside the gates. Sleep did not come easily. The men lay awake, their thoughts shifting between disbelief and resignation. Some tried to remember faces, mothers, wives, children, but the images slipped away, replaced by the texture of the walls, the sound of footsteps outside, the smell of damp wood. The camp had a way of erasing the past, even before the prisoners realized it. It was not done through violence but through monotony. Every sense was dulled, every moment flattened until only the present remained, the endless, unchanging now. Morning arrived with a whistle. The doors of the barracks swung open, and the cold rushed in like an accusation. Roll call was the first ritual. The prisoners formed lines in the yard, their breath rising in white clouds. Guards moved among them, counting, reciting numbers. Those who were missing were noted, and the living were dismissed to breakfast, if it could be called that. A ladle of thin soup, a crust of stale bread, a few sips of water. Hunger was no longer an emergency. It was the background hum of existence. Work details followed. Groups were assigned to dig, to haul, to repair. Others were sent outside the wire, to farms, to factories, to whatever labor the war still demanded. Each man carried his number on a tag, stamped into metal or cloth. It was the camp's way of keeping the illusion of control. The men moved as ordered, but their minds drifted. The camp had become a world apart, its own kind of ecosystem, with its own rules of survival. The guards, the fences, the barracks, even the weather, all were part of a single organism that fed on the slow degradation of will. In the afternoons, the light turned amber, falling through the haze of smoke that always seemed to hang above the camp. Dust glittered in the air. The prisoners' shadows stretched long across the ground, merging at the edges as though the boundaries between them were dissolving. The sounds of hammering, sawing, coughing, the dull, repetitive noises of life behind wire echoed faintly from one end of the compound to the other. At sunset, the gates closed again, though they had never truly opened. The guards walked their circuits, boots striking in rhythm. The dogs paced beside them, their chains clinking. Inside the barracks, the men sat quietly, staring at their hands, their faces, the knots in the wood. Some whispered to themselves, counting days that might already have been lost. Others said nothing at all, letting thought dissolve into the background hum of survival. Days became indistinguishable. The camp existed in a kind of suspended season, neither winter nor summer, only an endless twilight of grey. Time did not move forward here. It circled back upon itself. Every dawn was the same dawn. Every sound was an echo. Even the wind seemed trapped within the wire, sighing in endless repetition. The barbed wire marked the horizon, not only of the camp, but of the imagination. Beyond it lay the world, fields, forests, oceans, but those belonged to another reality, one that no longer seemed entirely real. For the prisoners, the fence had become the edge of everything they could remember or hope for. The mind stopped traveling, once the body could not. The camp did not kill swiftly, it erased slowly. Its power was not in brutality, but in continuity, the repetition of hunger, of roll calls, of orders given and obeyed, carved deep grooves into the spirit. The men learned to conserve not just food or strength, but emotion. Anger, sorrow, fear, all were too costly to maintain. What remained was endurance, a quiet, impersonal persistence. As night returned once more, the wind rose, carrying the faint sound of metal against metal, the whisper of the barbed wire shifting in the cold. A prisoner lying on the upper bunk listened to it and realized that the wire sang the same tune every night, the low, metallic hum of captivity. Beyond the fence, Somewhere in the darkness, other camps waited, filled with other voices, other silences. The world was wide, but it was all enclosed now, and when the next morning came, it brought not change but the same commands, the same rhythm, the same breathless continuity, the realization that captivity was not a moment but an eternity, measured one heartbeat at a time. The prisoners were led from the barracks into a courtyard where the air was thick with anticipation, damp wood, and the sharp tang of metal. Here the first act of erasure began, a ritual that transformed soldiers into numbers, names into marks, and identities into statistics. Men who had once been fathers, sons, engineers, farmers or scholars were now catalogued as commodities, their worth measured not by character or courage, but by the ability to obey and endure. A line of guards moved among them with the precision of machinery, counting, inspecting, and observing. Each man was told to remove his uniform, his coat, his insignias, and to leave behind anything that spoke of individuality. The sound of buttons, buckles, and belts hitting the wooden floor mingled with the muted murmur of restrained voices. Some men hesitated, fingers lingering on a watch, a photograph, or a locket. They were not punished for hesitation, not immediately, but a subtle gesture of impatience from a guard, a hard glance, a pointed rifle, sufficed to remind them that sentiment had no place here. Their uniforms, carefully worn and maintained through the rigors of battle, were taken, leaving many wrapped in the meagre folds of whatever tattered garments the camp allowed. Rank and medals were meaningless. Generals stood shoulder to shoulder with privates, all equalized by necessity, stripped of symbols of command, achievement, or distinction. Numbers were next. Metal tags were pressed into skin or pinned crudely to clothing, serving as a stark reminder that a man's essence was now defined by a figure scratched onto iron. Each prisoner was issued a number that would replace his name in the daily rolls, in the punishments, in the ration line. The number was more than an identifier. It was a cage within which memory and self would soon be contained. When a man whispered his own name, the sound seemed foreign in his own ears. The mind struggled to reconcile the continuity of personal memory with the reduction imposed by the number, a cognitive dissonance that the guards neither noticed nor cared about. Belongings, too, were confiscated, the remnants of a life outside the wire. Watches, rings, personal letters, religious items, tools, anything that suggested a private existence were taken and stored or destroyed. Men reached into pockets, held onto small items as long as possible, only to be ripped away by gloved hands. The act was deliberate, designed not just to control but to sever the last threads of autonomy. In some camps, prisoners were made to kneel while the officers rifled through their possessions, checking for contraband, any attempt at retaining individuality, even as a matter of memory. Each confiscation echoed through the prisoner's mind long after the guards had moved on. Those who resisted, even in small gestures, folding their hands differently, muttering under their breath, hiding a personal object, were noted. Punishments were not necessarily immediate, but the psychological weight of observation became relentless. Every movement, every glance, every attempt to retain a spark of personality was absorbed and catalogued by the watchful eyes above. The act of becoming a number was gradual. It did not occur in a single moment, but through countless small erasures, each one chipping away at the self. The barracks themselves reinforced the transformation. Cramped, dark, and uniform, the bunks held no markers of individuality. A man who tried to mark his space with a personal item was quickly corrected. The straw was flattened, the walls scrubbed, the bunk returned to impersonal perfection. Privacy was a memory. It had no place inside the barbed wire confines. In the morning roll calls, men were called by number alone. The sound of a name was rare, almost forbidden, as though the mere utterance could summon the chaos of humanity back into a space defined entirely by control and submission. The men's bodies, too, became instruments of the camp's order. They were shaved, cleaned, and uniformed in ragged clothing that erased distinctions of size, strength, and past identity. Hair, beard, and even fingernails, markers of individuality, were reduced under the logic of hygiene and intimidation. In some cases, tattoos or personal marks were forcibly removed or covered, an attempt to obliterate the narrative of life lived outside the fences. The physical transformation mirrored the mental one. The camp did not merely imprison the body, it sought to remold the psyche into something compliant, something abstract. Hunger and fatigue accelerated the process. When the body grows weak, the mind retreats and the sense of self becomes pliable. In the first days of captivity, as rations were halved and the walk from barracks to work detail lengthened, the prisoners began to measure themselves in units of survival, how long they could endure standing, walking, waiting, or kneeling without protest. The measure of a man's day was no longer deeds, courage, or thought, it was endurance. Each breath was a calculation, each step a submission. Even small acts of defiance, looking around when ordered to stare ahead, or speaking in one's own voice, were quickly crushed. The guards, whether German or Japanese, were meticulous about ritual. Order was enforced through repetition, observation, and quiet threat as much as through violence. The human mind, confronted with the same regimented impersonal routine day after day, slowly adjusted to its new environment. The transformation was subtle but total. Names, memories, desires, and fears became secondary to the constant maintenance of the body within the parameters set by the camp. The psychological consequences were immediate. Men began to speak to each other less, reserving words for essential communication. Their inner dialogue, once rich with plans, memories, or conjecture about the war, narrowed to survival calculations. A glance at a friend became a small act of rebellion, significant only for its rare reassurance of shared humanity. Over weeks, months, and years, even these small confirmations became precious, easily lost, and carefully protected. Religion, nationality, rank, all facets of the self that had previously defined social interaction were reduced to private whispers. In barracks where hundreds were held together, a man might think about God, his family, or his home country. But these thoughts were fragile. Speaking them aloud invited scrutiny or punishment. Silence became a shield, anonymity, a form of survival. Slowly, in every barrack and every work detail, the prisoners were reduced to bodies moving through a world of rules, numbers, and repetitions, their pasts fading like mist in morning sun. When new prisoners arrived, they were absorbed into this system with mechanical efficiency. The ritual repeated itself, each individual undergoing the same slow erasure. Witnessing this process reinforced the sense of inevitability. Captivity would claim every trace of individuality in its time. Even those who clung most fiercely to their memory, their pride, or their name, found themselves bending under the unrelenting weight of daily order, hunger, and exhaustion. In this way, identity was stripped, not by a single act of cruelty, but by the cumulative effect of 1,000 small, calculated measures, numbers assigned, names erased, uniforms confiscated, routines enforced, possessions taken, privacy denied, hunger administered, and observation made constant. The prisoners became abstracted into statistics, figures to be counted at roll calls, watched in work details, or recorded in camp logs. Their lives were no longer defined by choice, courage, or personality, but by endurance and compliance. By the end of the first weeks, the transformation was nearly complete. A man no longer remembered the sound of his own name without hesitation. He no longer recognized the contours of his former life in any vivid detail. He existed in the present, in the narrow world defined by fences, guards, and numbers. The mind, in its effort to survive, adapted, becoming quiet, obedient, and cautious. Memory itself became a luxury too heavy to maintain. Thus, the prisoners entered fully into the world of the camp, not merely confined, but redefined. Their bodies, their belongings, their names, and their memories were all reduced to components in a larger system. The wire, the guards, the barracks, and the routines were not only physical restraints, but instruments of psychological reshaping. A man learned quickly that survival depended not on resistance, but on surrender to the logic of the camp, on allowing the self to blur, dissolve, and merge into the ranks of the countless others trapped within the same horizon of barbed wire. And in that quiet, terrifying realization, the prisoners understood that the war had shifted again. It was no longer a conflict of nations, of armies, of artillery and strategy. It had become a battle of being, a slow, methodical war waged upon the essence of what it meant to be human, where victory meant only endurance and identity itself was the first casualty. Under the pale grey light of the early morning, the prisoners stirred on their wooden bunks, bodies stiff and joints aching from nights spent on cold, straw-strewn planks. Even before the sun's faint warmth touched the compound, an emptiness gnawed in every stomach, subtle at first, like a shadow stretching through muscle and bone, then relentless as hours passed. The prisoners had begun to measure time by hunger, and each sunrise was a reminder that the rationing of life had already begun. Bread, when it came, was a thin, hard slab barely the size of a hand. Soup, when ladled from a blackened kettle, was nothing more than water with some leaves or scraps of vegetable, boiled until all semblance of nourishment had been dissolved into the dull grey liquid. The body, at first shocked by the deprivation, tried to compensate. Hunger signals were ignored as the mind retreated into routines, standing, walking, bending, lifting, and the ceaseless counting of steps and minutes. Yet the adjustment came at a cost. Fatigue deepened, muscles softened, skin grew pallid and dry, hands trembled, faces hollowed into masks of endurance. Each man carried a private terror, a quiet desperation that could not be spoken aloud for fear of drawing attention. Even a whispered complaint or an impatient movement could draw the sharp attention of a guard, and in that environment, survival depended on restraint. Breakfast was never substantial. A crust of bread, dry and crumbly, was shared among the rows of prisoners with the care of those who understood the scarcity of what little had been given. The men chewed slowly, savoring each fragment, counting it, tasting it, as if it were something rare and sacred. The soup, thin and lifeless, was swirled in a tin cup and drunk in small sips, as though pouring too fast might waste the little warmth it carried. Some prisoners, watching others, would glance around furtively, fearing that those who had been faster or stronger might take more than their share. Though the camp rules left little chance for greed, those caught would be punished swiftly. By the afternoon, the body's response to deprivation became more obvious. Hands shook with weakness, stomach cramps twisted under ribs, the muscles contracting and recoiling like cords pulled too tight. The air seemed thicker, heavier with the absence of food, and the men began to move sluggishly during labor details, lifting, carrying, or bending with the mechanical repetition of weakened bodies. Even the mind itself felt dulled, thoughts slowing as survival replaced strategy, calculation, and memory. Hunger became a companion, constant, intimate, pressing at every moment, a reminder that the prisoner's existence had been reduced to the most basic of functions, to endure until the next ration, to maintain the ability to walk, to keep breathing, to keep counting the seconds. Dreams of food haunted the nights. Men would awaken with the taste of warm bread on their tongues, the smell of roasting meat in their noses, sensations that had not been experienced in days, weeks, or even months. Those fleeting images, vivid and tantalizing, served both as comfort and torment. When a meal appeared at last, no matter how insubstantial, it was eaten with a reverent silence, each bite a private ceremony of reclamation, however brief. Yet even these small victories were fleeting. By mid-afternoon, the stomach would again contract and twist, and the dull ache would settle into a familiar rhythm, a pulse as predictable and as inescapable as the rising and falling of the sun. Water, too, was rationed with grim precision. In some camps it was drawn from wells or collected from rain, often tepid and filled with sediment. In others it had to be carried from distant points, a labor in itself. Drinking too quickly risked punishment or illness. Drinking too slowly invited the same gnawing hunger to sharpen into desperation. The liquid sustenance offered little comfort, yet every sip was a reminder of the tenuous thread between survival and collapse. Hunger shaped the prisoners' daily routines. The hours were mapped around the rationing schedule, the work details, the roll calls. Each moment without food became an exercise in endurance, the mind forced to narrow, to calculate, to distract itself from the gnawing emptiness. Thoughts of home, of letters, of comrades lost, drifted in and out of consciousness, often giving way to a singular focus: how to make the body continue. Hunger became a defining presence, not merely a physical sensation but a psychological anchor, binding the prisoner's perception of time, space, and self to the rhythms imposed by those who controlled the camp. Illness followed naturally. Weakened bodies succumbed to disease, fatigue, and injury. Malnutrition made cuts, bruises, and infections slow to heal, and the prisoners' immune systems faltered. Dysentery, typhus, and scurvy appeared quietly at first, spreading with the intimacy of hunger's shadow. Each man watched himself and others, noting the subtle signs: dark circles under the eyes, pale lips, trembling limbs, vacant stares. Disease and hunger were intertwined, twin currents that slowly eroded both body and spirit, leaving little space for anything else. The psychological dimension of hunger was as profound as the physical. Men who once planned and strategized now measured existence in hours between meals. Memory and hope were filtered through the lens of deprivation. Conversations were minimal, often revolving around food, rumors of deliveries, scraps left behind, or techniques for stretching rations. Even dreams became dominated by sustenance: bread, meat, milk, fruit, and water. Desire shifted from abstract ambitions to the concrete reality of filling the stomach. Hunger defined the horizon of thought. It became the framework for all emotion, dulling joy, amplifying anxiety, and making even survival an achievement worth recognizing. When the men were sent to work details outside the camp, hauling logs, repairing roads, digging trenches, or working in laborious agricultural fields, the weight of hunger became almost physical, pressing down on muscles and joints, sapping endurance and alertness. Some stumbled and fell, their legs unable to support the frame they had once carried with pride. The guards noted the weakness silently. Some allowed the faltering to pass, others used it to enforce punishment or intimidation. Yet even in collapse, the prisoners learned to adapt, balancing pain with necessity, conserving energy for the moment when sustenance, however meager, might arrive. Hunger also influenced relationships among prisoners. The meager rations encouraged both caution and generosity. A shared crust of bread became an intimate act, a rare form of communication and trust. The exchange of water or a scrap of food fostered bonds that were otherwise impossible within the rigid structure of the camp. Simultaneously, scarcity bred suspicion. Every small crumb could inspire fear of theft or betrayal. In this environment, human interaction was filtered through the lens of deprivation, transforming ordinary gestures into critical calculations of survival. As weeks and months passed, the prisoners' bodies adapted, though at a severe cost. Metabolism slowed, muscles weakened, energy was conserved as instinctively as a flame clinging to the last breath of oxygen. The mind became both sharper and dulled, sharper in the calculation of survival, dulled in memory, emotion, and sensation. Hunger was no longer merely a feeling. It was a lens through which life was perceived, the invisible companion shadowing every thought, every motion, every decision. By the time the prisoners became accustomed to the rhythm of the camp, the roll calls, work details, rationing, and punishments, hunger was no longer an external force but part of the internal landscape. It shaped not only the body but the mind, determining perception, priorities, and even identity. Men spoke less of themselves and more of the food they could anticipate, imagining tastes, textures, and aromas with a vividness that bordered on obsession. Hunger became a ghostly companion, a silent tutor in endurance, teaching lessons that no drill or weapon could impart: the limits of the body, the persistence of will, and the quiet terror of a world in which the simplest, most basic need was no longer guaranteed. Even when the night brought rest, hunger persisted. Dreams became laboratories of longing, projecting memory into the impossible. Bread, fruit, and meat appeared vividly, often cruelly, fading upon waking into the thin soup and stale bread of reality. Hunger was never absent. It was a rhythm as reliable as the rising sun, shaping time and experience, warping perception and redefining life itself within the narrow confines of wire and barracks. It was within this daily communion with emptiness that the prisoners' world narrowed, that their lives became measured not in years or accomplishments, but in the ability to endure, to walk, to breathe, and to wait for the next ration. Hunger had become companion, tormentor, and instructor, omnipresent and absolute, shaping every moment of life behind the fences of captivity, carving both body and mind in slow, relentless erosion. Under the cold, indifferent sky, the prisoners were assembled once again, shuffled from their barracks in the rigid lines demanded by their captors. The morning light fell weakly across the compound, diffused by mist and smoke, casting long, indistinct shadows over the rows of men who moved like automatons. The air was sharp with frost, or in warmer regions, thick with humidity, clinging to the skin like a reminder of the relentless physicality of the day ahead. Hunger had become a persistent companion, gnawing at muscle and mind alike, yet it was secondary now to the rhythm of labor that awaited them beyond the wire. The guards led them through the camp gates into fields that seemed both expansive and inescapable. Here the prisoners would spend the bulk of daylight hours, often in harsh environments far from the relative shelter of the barracks. In some regions they were marched along the unfinished stretches of railway, the iron tracks glinting dully under pale sunlight, their ties uneven and splintered. Each man carried a pick, a shovel or a load of heavy material, the weight of which quickly became more than their weakened bodies could comfortably bear. The work was not measured in tasks completed or progress made, but in the unceasing passage of time, the endless repetition of movement and effort. Men fell into a rhythm dictated by necessity and fear. Picks struck stone with a repetitive clamor that echoed through valleys or forests, filling the air with a dull, grinding resonance. Shovels scraped earth, rocks clattered against one another, and chains rattled whenever someone's load was particularly heavy. The noise, though chaotic in theory, became methodical in practice. Every sound, every movement, every breath was absorbed into the slow, hypnotic pattern of labor, a cadence that left little room for thought beyond the mechanics of survival. The environment was never neutral. In the northern camps of Europe, winter's frost bit into exposed skin, leaving hands raw and feet numb despite layers of tattered clothing. Snow and ice turned the ground into a treacherous path, slowing every movement and increasing the risk of injury. Limbs weakened by hunger and malnutrition trembled under the strain. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes and ears, often silently, sometimes permanently. In the jungles and river valleys of Southeast Asia, oppressive heat and humidity carried the constant threat of tropical disease, while the muddy terrain made carrying heavy loads almost impossible without slipping or straining muscles beyond endurance. The prisoners were often made to work for hours without pause. Rain or shine, heat or snow, the labor continued. Rations were insufficient for recovery. The men's bodies were pushed beyond natural limits, and yet the work showed no sign of slowing. Supervising officers, whether German or Japanese, maintained a meticulous schedule. Breaks were brief and infrequent, given only when absolutely necessary to prevent collapse that would hinder productivity. The guards moved among the prisoners with detached attention, ensuring the continuity of order. No energy was wasted on compassion. The prisoners' suffering was incidental to the execution of labor. The monotony of effort compounded the psychological strain. As the day wore on, the prisoners' minds often retreated into a kind of automatic consciousness, focusing on the swing of the arm, the lift of a shovel, the placement of stones along a track. This dissociation, while protective, also deepened the sense of erasure already begun in the camp. Men no longer identified themselves by profession, rank, or skill. They were tools in the process, extensions of the labor itself, their personal histories fading under the weight of repetition and exhaustion. Fatigue spread quickly through the lines. Limbs ached, backs bent, and feet blistered. The cold or heat seeped into every joint. Muscles screamed, yet the prisoners continued, driven by the necessity of survival and the fear of punishment. Those who stumbled were often struck with the flat of a rifle or the butt of a club, or compelled to rise under the watchful glare of armed guards. The physicality of punishment was often minimal compared to the mental oppression of knowing that failure or collapse could bring severe consequences. Every motion, therefore, was weighted with tension, every movement conscious of the scrutiny above. The landscape of labor was itself a constant lesson in endurance. Rocky hillsides had to be leveled, tree trunks dragged through mud, canals dug to redirect water, embankments reinforced with stone and earth. Each task demanded not only physical strength but patience and the capacity to absorb discomfort for hours at a time. The natural elements became allies of the camp. Wind stripped warmth from the body, rain and mud increased toil, and the sun sapped energy in its slow, relentless arc across the sky. Hunger and exhaustion compounded every difficulty, making each simple task feel monumental. The soundscape of the workday was a slow, grinding rhythm, picks striking rock, shovels scraping soil, chains clattering against posts, boots dragging through mud. These sounds were constant, measured, hypnotic. The men's breathing was synchronized with the effort, shallow or ragged according to exhaustion. Occasionally a cough or groan would pierce the pattern, yet it was quickly swallowed by the noise of labor and the indifferent wind. Silence, like freedom, was no longer part of the environment. Rest periods were fleeting, almost ceremonial. Prisoners were allowed to pause, if only briefly, often in a tight group, heads bowed, shoulders shaking with fatigue. Water, when available, was consumed with careful, deliberate sips. Food, if it came at all, was shared in near silence, measured down to the last crumb or drop. Conversation during labor was rare. Words slowed the pace, wasted energy, and risked attention from guards. Communication was reduced to glances, gestures, or subtle signals, private measures of reassurance amid the vast impersonal machinery of work. The physical and mental strain combined to erode individuality. Men became defined not by their previous identities, but by their capacity to labor, the steadiness of their swing, the endurance of their step, the ability to continue despite pain or illness. Memory, thought, and personality were secondary. The body's function became primary. Even dreams at night reflected this rhythm, the echo of strikes against stone, the dragging of loads through mud, the endless repetition of the day's toil. In certain regions, the work itself carried additional dangers. Unstable embankments could collapse, rails could shift unexpectedly, or disease could flourish in stagnant water. Every injury, however minor, was amplified by the lack of medical care and the weakened state of the prisoners. A twisted ankle could incapacitate a man for days, a deep cut could fester into infection, a minor illness could spiral into life-threatening weakness. Guards enforced continuity, indifferent to suffering, and often punished those who slowed the collective pace. As the day ended, prisoners were marched back to camp, bodies exhausted but still conscious, aware that the labor would resume the next day without deviation. The return through the camp gates was quiet, save for the occasional bark of a guard or the low murmur of a prisoner staggering behind another for support. Hunger returned to remind them that labor had not quenched the physical need for sustenance. Pain lingered in every joint and muscle, yet the mind had adapted to measure existence by effort and endurance. Night in the barracks was a brief reprieve. Limbs rested but muscles ached. Sleep was shallow and intermittent, haunted by the rhythm of the day, swinging picks, clattering chains, dragging loads through mud. Hunger persisted, gnawing at the edges of consciousness. Dreams often replayed the day's labor in surreal, elongated sequences, as though the mind had internalized the monotonous, methodical violence of work. The prisoners had begun to live inside the mechanics of their toil, their identities entwined with effort and exhaustion, their sense of self increasingly defined by persistence rather than personality. And so the cycle continued, the unending march to labor, the repetition of strikes, shovels, and chains, the ceaseless observation of guards, the constant presence of hunger and fatigue. The prisoners became shadows moving through the fields, each action deliberate, measured, and necessary, their bodies and minds reshaped by the slow, methodical pressure of enforced work. In this crucible, endurance became the sole measure of life, and each day survived was both victory and punishment, a testament to human persistence under the relentless machinery of captivity. Under the dim grey light that filtered through the narrow slats of the barracks, the prisoners moved with the deliberate caution of those who knew every sound might betray weakness. The air was thick with the coppery tang of unwashed bodies, the damp scent of straw, and the underlying persistent stench of decay that seemed to seep from the earth itself. Here in the shadowed corners of the camp, sickness moved as quietly and inexorably as hunger, claiming the weakened, the tired, and the unlucky with a patience that was as cruel as it was methodical. Typhus, malaria, dysentery, and a host of lesser infections stalked the prisoners, taking advantage of bodies already diminished by cold, exhaustion, and starvation. The diseases spread not with haste but with the quiet inevitability of time itself, a creeping presence that could not be resisted with force or will. The barracks set aside for the sick, if they could even be called hospitals, were filled with men who had long since ceased to function as soldiers or even as individuals. Wooden bunks were crowded so closely together that movement became a negotiation between one body and the next. The air was hot with sweat and fever, suffused with the dry, raspy coughs of those whose lungs were failing, the intermittent groans of men whose stomachs had been ravaged by dysentery. Light, when it came, was pale and filtered through dirt-smeared windows, falling in thin bars across the straw and the dust-laden floor, illuminating pallid faces hollowed by disease and malnutrition. In these rooms, the distinction between living and dead blurred, becoming a gradient rather than a boundary. The sick were tended in a minimal, functional manner, if at all. There were no comforting words, no gentle hands, only the occasional inspection by a guard or medical orderly. Some men lay unattended for hours, their bodies racked by fever, their minds lost in delirium. In some corners men whispered to each other, holding hands or murmuring prayers, but these gestures were small islands in a vast sea of suffering. Often a man would expire quietly in the night, unnoticed until the next roll call or the morning sweep of the guards. The body was removed, the straw shifted, and the barracks returned to the same muted rhythm as before. Death became routine, a fact of life as unremarkable as cold or hunger. Disease did not respect rank, experience, or training. Officers and privates alike succumbed to its slow, unrelenting power. A soldier who had survived battles, ambushes, and the gunfire of war could be felled in days by a fever or an infection contracted from standing too long in mud or from drinking contaminated water. Malaria came with its cyclical torment, shivering, sweating, hallucinations, and the profound exhaustion of the body fighting itself. Typhus, spread by lice that thrived in the crowded, unwashed barracks, caused fever, delirium, and rashes that spread like a stain across skin already sallow from hunger. Dysentery stole strength from the gut, leaving the body hollowed, the mind distracted entirely by physical pain. The prisoners learned to recognize these afflictions not just in themselves but in others. The low moan of fevered breathing, the dull, glassy eyes, the way a man bent over himself as if to hold in invisible pain, these were signals that the disease was advancing, that the line between endurance and surrender was shrinking. The sick were often isolated or segregated, but not for their benefit. Isolation was a pragmatic necessity. Overcrowded barracks could not accommodate the spread, and the weak slowed work details and roll calls. Yet even in separation, the prisoners were never free from the omnipresence of illness. The air itself seemed heavy with contagion, thick with the invisible threat that might claim the next body at any moment. Medical care, when it existed, was minimal, rudimentary, and often cruelly inadequate. The simplest remedies, quinine for malaria, antiseptics for infected wounds, or even clean water and rest, were rare and inconsistently applied. Medicines were limited, sometimes outdated, sometimes entirely absent. The ill were left to endure as best they could, their recovery dependent largely on the strength of a body already starved and exhausted. The guards and administrators moved among the barracks, sometimes noting the gravely ill, sometimes ignoring them entirely, their concern only that the flow of labor and order continue. Hygiene, or the lack thereof, compounded the problems. Lice, fleas, and other parasites flourished in the crowded, damp conditions. Men were forced to remain in soiled clothing for days or weeks, their skin blistered and raw from scratching. Disease found purchase wherever it could, in the hair, in the cracks of fingernails, in sores that could not heal. Even the act of washing, a rare privilege, could be futile, the water tepid and contaminated. The camp itself, indifferent to human needs, became a breeding ground for illness, a machine of slow, relentless attrition. Witnessing death was unavoidable. When a man fell, it was observed by others, the body sometimes removed immediately, other times left in place, a stark reminder of mortality. The proximity of death shaped the survivors. They moved quietly, whispered minimally, and developed subtle strategies for survival, such as resting in shifts, sharing scant water, or finding positions that minimized physical exertion. The experience of watching comrades succumb, day after day, fostered a detached awareness. Empathy became a careful calculation, rationed as carefully as food or effort. Disease and decay also eroded the mind. Delirium and fever led men to drift in consciousness, blurring reality and hallucination. Time became slippery, marked not by hours or days, but by the repetition of symptoms, chills, shivers, heat, sweats, and exhaustion. Memory of life before the camp became hazy, often inaccessible. Even thoughts of home or family were replaced by a mental landscape dominated by bodily sensation, where the primary goal was to survive the next hour, the next symptom, the next wave of physical torment. The camp's hierarchy, in its indifferent fashion, reinforced the omnipresence of illness. Men with some minimal medical training or leadership were sometimes tasked with tending to the sick, but they were themselves weakened by hunger and fatigue. The responsibility of care fell unevenly, often exposing them to additional risk. Their efforts could prolong life, ease pain slightly, but rarely could they overcome the fundamental conditions of deprivation that allowed disease to flourish. In this environment, the boundary between the living and the dead was not fixed. Men lingered on the edge for days, bodies swaying with fever, skin mottled, eyes half closed, neither fully present nor fully gone. Some recovered only to succumb later, their strength sapped permanently by repeated illness. Others passed quickly, leaving small clusters of companions to absorb the grief and the practical necessities of removing the body. Life and death were continuous, overlapping states, part of a rhythm dictated by the camp rather than by human will. Even labor was affected by illness. Weak men were shuffled to the back of work columns, where they moved with measured steps, careful not to collapse in view of guards. A misstep could mean punishment or further degradation. Sick men became shadows, ghosts of their former selves, their presence a reminder of the fragility of the body under conditions of sustained deprivation. Their endurance, when it persisted, was both marvel and tragedy, demonstrating the capacity of the human body to resist even as it is methodically stripped of vitality. Through months and years, the presence of disease shaped every decision, every movement, every thought. Prisoners developed tacit rules: avoid touching contaminated surfaces, distance oneself from coughing neighbors, ration attention and energy, conserve warmth, and recognize early signs of infection in oneself and others. These survival strategies were learned slowly, painfully, often too late for those already weakened. The body became a site of constant vigilance, a battlefield in itself, as significant and relentless as any front line of the war outside the camp. Even when the evening arrived, and the prisoners returned to their barracks, disease lingered like a silent fog. The smell of sickness, the sounds of labored breathing, the low moans of fevered bodies, all permeated the air. Sleep, already elusive, was fragmented by coughing fits, delirious murmurs, and the weight of exhaustion. The mind, unable to disentangle itself from the constant awareness of mortality, grew quiet, withdrawn, and mechanical. Survival depended on a balance of will, endurance, and the ability to ignore pain while attending, just enough, to self-preservation. In these barracks, the prisoners came to understand that the camp's control extended not only through wire and guard, hunger and labor, but through the very fragility of the body itself. Disease, like hunger, was an instrument of subjugation. It was invisible, yet pervasive, and its presence forced every man to confront mortality daily. In the blurred line between life and death, every breath became an act of defiance, every movement a subtle victory against a system designed to erode the essence of being. And so, in the shadowed corners of these infirmaries, behind the wire, under the unyielding eyes of the guards, and the omnipresent spectre of disease, the prisoners learned to live within decay, to navigate the slow erosion of life, and to endure not because hope remained, but because the human spirit, even in extremity, persisted through the most minimal acts of daily survival. The guards moved along the perimeter with a quiet, deliberate precision, their boots striking the frozen or muddy earth with the rhythmic certainty of a machine. They were not shouting or enraged, nor were they acting with any sense of personal malice. Their cruelty was abstract, a function of role and routine rather than feeling. Faces were blank, eyes steady, mouths tight, their attention fixed not on individuals as human beings, but on the maintenance of order, the uninterrupted operation of the camp, and the execution of regulations written elsewhere, by officers far removed from the immediate suffering. To the prisoners, the guards' indifference was more terrifying than outright rage, for it suggested a system that functioned independently of human conscience. The violence, the deprivation, the punishment and the slow decay of bodies and minds were not personal vendettas, but predictable outputs of a mechanism that could not falter. From the first light of dawn to the muted fall of evening, the guards patrolled the lines of wire and barracks, moving methodically across the compound. They were often paired with dogs, whose restrained growls and periodic lunges reinforced an omnipresent sense of surveillance. In some camps, guards were armed with rifles, their barrels polished and heavy, ready not merely for enforcement, but as symbols of authority. The prisoners quickly learned that resistance was not only futile but irrelevant. The guards were extensions of the camp itself, embodying its logic, its schedule, and its priorities. Each command, gesture, or look was a demonstration of efficiency rather than passion. The indifference extended beyond mere oversight. Punishments were meted out not as emotional retribution but as routine responses to deviations from expected behavior. A man who faltered during roll call, whose uniform was disheveled, or whose assigned work pace slowed, might receive a strike from a baton, a forced march, or an additional labor detail. These acts were not cruel in the way of personal anger, but methodical in execution, a predictable correction designed to reinforce rules, maintain order, and ensure that the machinery of captivity functioned without interruption. In witnessing these measures, prisoners came to understand that the greatest threat was not malice, but consistency, the cold, unyielding regularity of authority. The guards' schedules were themselves a testament to the abstraction of cruelty. Hours were divided into precise segments: patrols, inspections, roll calls, meals, labor details, and surveillance. Each action was performed according to protocol, as if the human element were secondary to the execution of procedure. Eye contact was measured and purposeful. Silence was enforced through presence rather than speech. The prisoners quickly discerned the subtle variations in command, noting which guards were more vigilant, which measured their attention carefully, and which executed their responsibilities with almost bureaucratic disinterest. Yet every guard in his own manner contributed to the pervasive pressure that reshaped the prisoner's physical and psychological state. Observation itself was a weapon. The mere act of being watched for long stretches of time had profound effects on behavior and morale. Men moved more slowly or more cautiously when under scrutiny, their every action a potential subject for correction or punishment. Even when guards were stationary in watchtowers, their presence created a sense of omnipresence, Prisoners came to internalize their gaze, regulating thought and movement to conform to an unseen standard. Over time, the prisoners' minds adjusted, prioritizing compliance above all else. In the camp's ecosystem, obedience was rewarded with endurance, and subtle resistance was punished or observed silently until it could be corrected efficiently. The indifference extended to the suffering of the prisoners themselves. Men weakened by hunger, labor, and disease were observed without comment, assessed not in terms of individual pain but in relation to their functionality. Fevered bodies, coughing and trembling limbs were catalogued by the guards as part of the operational environment, like broken tools or failing equipment. In this way, the human cost became a metric, not a moral question. Pain and weakness were visible but irrelevant to judgment. Only capacity for labor, submission to order, and adherence to protocol mattered. Violence, when enacted, was similarly detached. Strikes, beatings, and other forms of physical punishment were delivered with mechanical precision. A baton might fall on a hunched back, a rifle butt might strike a shoulder, a forced run might be ordered across frozen or muddy ground, all executed without apparent emotion. The guards were trained to avoid excess, to prevent unnecessary death, and to maintain the camp's operational stability. Cruelty was codified and neutralized, a systematic expression of authority rather than passion. In this, the prisoners learned a new form of terror, the absence of empathy, the prioritization of function over humanity. Conversations among the guards, when they occurred, were utilitarian, centered on schedules, rationing, discipline, and protocol. Personal sentiment rarely intruded. Those who expressed doubt or hesitation were either reprimanded or replaced, reinforcing a culture in which human feeling was suppressed in favor of obedience. The detachment, once observed, became a model of behavior that further isolated the prisoners. Any attempt to appeal to morality, to plead for leniency, or to protest injustice collided with a wall of procedural indifference. The only effective language was compliance. Resistance, even if principled, met the same neutral scrutiny as fatigue or illness. The guards' indifference also manifested in the handling of deaths and injuries. When a prisoner fell, whether from disease, exhaustion, or injury sustained in labor, the response was regulated by procedure. Bodies were removed in silence, medical attention administered only when required for operational stability, and the space returned to routine. Mourning was private, fleeting, and largely invisible. The absence of the fallen became another element in the rhythm of the camp. The prisoners learned that their lives were judged not by value or character, but by their contribution to the ordered flow of the compound. This methodical cruelty reshaped interactions among the prisoners themselves. Trust became cautious, gestures of empathy were rationed, and behavior was filtered through the lens of observation. Knowing that the guards' indifference was constant, prisoners adapted, internalizing rules that were not moral but practical: move as required, comply, conserve energy, avoid notice. In this way, the machinery of detachment extended beyond the guards, infiltrating thought and behavior, bending the very essence of human interaction to the logic of control. The psychological impact was profound. Men came to fear less the threat of violence than the certainty of its application, less the presence of brutality than the persistence of indifference. They understood that suffering would continue regardless of protest or appeal, and that survival required an acceptance of the camp's impartiality. In this environment, fear became abstract, a constant awareness of potential consequence rather than an immediate response to action. The prisoners learned to measure themselves by endurance, observation, and the careful calibration of energy and movement. Even at night, when the camp seemed quieter, the influence of the guards persisted. Watchtowers cast thin, sweeping beams of light across the compound, tracing the movements of any who strayed or faltered. Footsteps on frozen mud or the clink of chains echoed in the silence, reminders of vigilance. Prisoners became acutely aware of their own bodies, movements, and the smallest deviations from expectation. Indifference, once understood, became a form of control as absolute as hunger or disease. The absence of empathy was an omnipresent force, shaping behavior with subtlety and relentlessness. Through months and years, the guards' indifference molded the prisoners' reality as much as any wire fence or rationed meal. Their faces, blank and steady, became symbols of the system itself. Their presence, measured and unyielding, communicated that survival depended not on appeal or strength, but on compliance, endurance and adaptation. In this relentless environment, cruelty was no longer a visible act but a structural condition, an invisible architecture built of procedure, observation, and the quiet, unyielding imposition of order. In the end, the prisoners came to understand that the most dangerous force in the camp was neither anger nor malice, but cold efficiency. The guards' blank faces, measured steps, and unflinching attention were constant reminders that the machinery of captivity was self-sustaining. The human cost was secondary. Suffering, illness, fatigue, and death were inevitable variables in the broader system. Compliance, endurance, and quiet resilience were the only factors that could influence outcome, and even then, only partially. Thus, within the walls of wire and barracks, the prisoner's world was defined not only by hunger, labor, and disease, but by the steady, indifferent presence of those who watched, enforced, and maintained the rhythm of captivity with a detachment that was, in its own way, as absolute and inevitable as death itself. The arrival of winter brought with it a quiet, relentless force that pressed into every corner of the camp, seeping into barracks, muscles, and bones alike. Snow fell in endless sheets, blanketing the fences, the thinly layered wooden barracks, and the narrow paths carved into mud and ice. The prisoners awoke to mornings in which the world seemed muted, each breath visible in the cold air, curling and vanishing like the fragile traces of life itself. The frost was indiscriminate, claiming the strongest and the weakest with the same slow inevitability. Hands stiffened, toes numbed, and the sharp bite of icy wind carried through tattered clothing to settle deep within the body. There was no respite. The cold was constant, indifferent, and in its own way, more potent than any instrument of punishment wielded by the guards. The frozen ground hardened beneath the prisoners' boots, making every step a careful negotiation. Mud, once yielding, became slabs of ice that buckled and shifted unpredictably, twisting ankles and forcing muscles to strain in ways that would soon sap energy from bodies already weakened by hunger. The wind cut across the open fields where labor was demanded, cutting faces and hands, numbing fingers until they were nearly useless. Frostbite was silent and invisible at first, creeping along toes, fingers, and ears before the pain revealed itself, a delayed and sharp reminder of vulnerability. Those who faltered or slowed in work, carrying heavy loads or performing repetitive labor, risked the wrath of the guards, whose indifference made no allowance for the limitations imposed by cold and weakened bodies. Within the barracks, the cold penetrated the walls and floors. Straw bedding offered little warmth, and thin, shared blankets were insufficient to stave off the creeping chill. Men huddled close, bodies pressed together for heat, yet even in clusters, shivering persisted. Sleep was shallow, broken by discomfort, and the persistent ache of frozen limbs. Nights became long, stretching into hours of trembling silence, punctuated only by the occasional cough, groan, or shifting of bodies in an attempt to find some ephemeral relief from the cold. The barracks, once merely a place of confinement, became a crucible in which the frost itself acted as a subtle, relentless agent of punishment. The winter imposed its own schedule on the prisoners, independent of guards, roll calls, or rationing. Hours were measured not by sunlight or labor, but by the toll of cold upon the body, the slow stiffness of joints, the deepening paleness of skin, the increasing difficulty of movement. Frost seemed to occupy every space between men, creeping along the ground, curling around ankles, insinuating itself under clothing, and into every exposed inch. Even water, when available, was bitterly cold, and the act of drinking became a brief confrontation with the elements, each sip a reminder that survival was inseparable from endurance of the frozen environment. The natural world, once a distant backdrop to the horrors of labor and hunger, became a relentless participant in the prisoners' suffering. The snow silenced sounds, footsteps, voices, the clatter of chains, leaving a stillness that was almost suffocating. Birds and insects had vanished, leaving only the sound of the wind scraping against wire and timber. The quiet magnified every small noise, a cough, the scrape of boots against ice, the faint rustle of straw. Time itself seemed slowed, stretching interminably, as the prisoners moved through an environment that was both frozen and indifferent, where every motion was labor and every breath was expenditure. The frost took its toll on work details as well. Carrying logs, shoveling frozen earth, and lifting stone became exercises in endurance against not only physical resistance, but the penetrating cold that robbed muscles of strength. Fingers grew numb, toes lost feeling, and limbs betrayed the mind with sudden tremors. Blisters and sores formed more readily in freezing temperatures, slow to heal, while frostbite occasionally led to permanent injury. Those who fell behind were reminded swiftly of the guards' indifference. A stumble or slowed pace invited a sharp gesture, a blow or a reprimand that carried no trace of empathy. The psychological weight of winter was as profound as the physical. The cold, in its still, unrelenting presence, became a weapon that required no motion, no intent, and no anger to be effective. It imposed vigilance, sapped morale, and amplified the prisoner's sense of isolation. Each man became acutely aware of his body as a fragile instrument, susceptible to forces beyond control. In the frozen hours, thoughts drifted inevitably toward mortality, the realization that a lapse, a faltering, or simply the failure of the body to endure could result in permanent injury or death. Winter rendered the invisible visible, highlighting every weakness, every failing, and every limitation. Within the barracks, social bonds were tested under the pressure of frost. Men huddled together for warmth, but even the human body could not fully compensate for the exposure. Some prisoners shared blankets, food and clothing, small acts of defiance against the indifferent environment, gestures of solidarity that were both survival strategies and faint reminders of human connection. Others withdrew, conserving warmth and energy for themselves, the instinct for self-preservation overriding the fragile bonds of companionship. Every interaction was filtered through the cold, which imposed not merely discomfort but a constant pressing evaluation of how much a man could endure, how much he could give, and how much he could hold on to without succumbing. The frost also interacted with hunger and disease in devastating ways. A body weakened by starvation burned more calories to maintain warmth. Illness made the cold harder to resist. Fevered prisoners shivered in contradictory rhythms, heat from disease battling frost from environment, leaving the mind and body in constant exhausting tension. Even those who were marginally strong found their endurance tested beyond previous limits. The winter environment acted as a slow but absolute equalizer, exacerbating every vulnerability and rendering the camp's other torments more immediate and unyielding. As nights deepened and storms gathered, the landscape of barbed wire and barracks became otherworldly, blanketed in ice and snow. Shadows lengthened, and every form, fence, tree, body, became softened by frost. The prisoners moved through this world in muted patterns, their silhouettes small against the harsh expanse, each footstep deliberate, each breath visible and transient in the frigid air. Silence dominated, broken only by the occasional cough, groan, or distant bark of a guard dog, sounds magnified by the emptiness echoing through the frozen landscape. In this stillness, despair and reflection intertwined. Men contemplated the vastness of time, the inevitability of winter's return, and the slow erosion of their own bodies and spirits. Memories of warmth, sunlight, and free movement became fragile, almost hallucinatory, fading under the relentless pressure of frost and deprivation. Sleep, when it came, was broken by cold and discomfort, each waking a reminder that the world beyond the wire offered no reprieve. The winter without end became not merely a season but a state of being, a constant invisible enforcer of the camp's cruel logic. Even routine tasks became trials of endurance, fetching water, preparing minimal meals, or moving between barracks and labor sites, demanded a negotiation with frost that consumed strength and attention. Men learned to anticipate its effects, shuffling rather than stepping, curling fingers into fists to preserve warmth, layering clothing in improvisatory fashion. Every adaptation was an acknowledgement that the cold was omnipotent, that the body must negotiate not just hunger, labor, and disease, but the relentless, impartial assault of the environment itself. In these frozen months, the prisoner's perception of time was altered. Days and nights blended under heavy snow and grey skies. The sun appeared briefly, weakly, as if hesitant to intrude upon this world. Minutes stretched interminably. Hours became exercises in silent calculation, and weeks passed with a uniformity shaped by frost, labor, and the subtle rhythms of survival. The mind retreated into routines of calculation and conservation, preserving energy and thought for the tasks necessary to endure rather than for memory, hope, or planning. Winter, in its still omnipresent cruelty, became both punishment and teacher. It demanded attention to every small detail: clothing, movement, energy, and endurance. It transformed simple acts of survival, walking, standing, breathing, sleeping, into profound tests of will. The prisoners learned that the cold was not temporary. It would return inexorably, and every encounter with frost, every step across ice, every exposure to wind, was preparation for the inevitable repetition. It became a constant shaping not only bodies but minds, forging a psychological landscape defined by vigilance, endurance, and silent resignation. In this frozen expanse, amid the snow-covered barracks and barbed wire, the prisoner's world was distilled to its essentials: the preservation of warmth, the avoidance of frostbite, the careful rationing of energy, and the quiet negotiation with death and disease. Winter was a weapon without human hands, a discipline imposed not through malice but through natural inevitability, a silent enforcer that required nothing but presence to demand obedience. Each frozen breath, each aching limb, each step across the icy earth became part of the relentless calculus of survival in a world where the seasons themselves were agents of captivity. The camp settled into a rhythm defined not by sunlight or seasons, but by the ceaseless cadence of labor and the accompanying sounds that filled the air like a slow, relentless symphony. From the earliest hours of dawn, the prisoners awoke not to birdsong or the gentle hum of the world outside, but to the harsh, mechanical noises that had come to define existence behind the wire. The hammering of picks against stone, the rhythmic scraping of shovels through frozen earth, and the steady clatter of chains became omnipresent, echoing across the compound, bouncing from the barracks to the watchtowers, reverberating off the wire fences, and lingering in every corner where men moved or rested. It was not music, strictly speaking, but a soundtrack of survival, a constant reminder of the labor that was both punishment and sustenance. The soundscape of the camp was immersive, saturating every moment and saturating perception. The crack of wood under pressure, the metallic scrape of rails being aligned, and the dull thud of stones falling into place formed a rhythm that was unbroken, unyielding, and mechanical. Even the human voice became part of this grim chorus. Coughing fits, low groans, labored breathing, and the occasional muttered word punctuated the mechanical sounds of labor. The air itself seemed to vibrate with these noises, pressing into the prisoners' ears, into their minds, and into their bodies, imprinting a continuous awareness of work, repetition, and endurance. Monotony, as it turned out, was more than a backdrop. It was an instrument of psychological control. The repetitive nature of labor, when combined with the persistent and omnipresent sounds of exertion, served to dull the mind's capacity for hope or memory. Men who had once measured time by letters, by meals, or by distant family memories, now counted the rhythm of hammers, shovels, and chains. Minutes were tracked not by the sun's arc, but by the repetition of motion, the cyclical beat of work, and the predictable punctuations of exhaustion. The mind, over time, became attuned to these sounds, interpreting them as signals of survival, rather than stimuli for thought, reflection, or emotion. Even when labor ceased, the sounds lingered in memory, Echoing through moments of rest in barracks or brief pauses between tasks, coughs and moans became imprinted on the brain, recalled in the quiet moments when the prisoners attempted to sleep or merely exist without motion. Men began to forget the laughter of the world beyond the wire, the voices of friends or family, the simple joy of speech unfiltered by fear or survival. Sounds of life became muted, replaced by the camp's own relentless rhythm, a music that demanded attention and shaped perception, eroding the boundaries between work, suffering, and consciousness. The repetition had a numbing effect, not only on thought but also on physical perception of pain. Blisters on hands, strained muscles, frostbitten toes, and fevered limbs were attended to in the same mechanical fashion as shovels or stones. Each was acknowledged, endured, and incorporated into the ongoing flow of labor. Pain became a metric of endurance rather than a signal demanding response. The mind learned to prioritize survival and task completion over discomfort, creating a dissociation between awareness of suffering and emotional reaction to it. Over time, this detachment became instinctive, a necessary adaptation to an environment in which every deviation from rhythm could invite punishment or death. Sound also dictated social interaction within the camp. The ever-present noise made private conversation difficult, reducing verbal communication to hushed exchanges, gestures, or brief, coded murmurs. Emotional expression was minimized, both as a survival strategy and because the pervasive rhythm of labor overshadowed it. Men began to measure connection and camaraderie in small, subtle acts: the passing of a ration, a shared glance, the timing of a step to ease a neighbor's burden. All else was subsumed into the soundscape, into the unbroken cycle of hammering, shoveling, and scraping, which reinforced a collective adaptation to monotony and suffering. Even the guards contributed to this acoustic ecosystem. Their calls, commands, and footfalls punctuated the rhythms of labor, a constant reminder of oversight, authority, and control. The mechanical regularity of orders, the absence of emotional inflection, and the predictable timing of inspections reinforced the prisoner's understanding that survival depended on obedience and adaptation rather than resistance or protest. In this context, the auditory environment became a form of subtle discipline, a medium through which the prisoner's thoughts, movements, and sense of identity were gradually reshaped. Repetition extended beyond the physical acts of work to the temporal structure of the day. Roll calls, ration distributions, labor details, and return to barracks were all governed by unchanging schedules, each segment punctuated by the characteristic sounds of effort, submission, and oversight. Days merged into weeks, weeks into months, with the constancy of auditory cues providing both a framework for survival and a subtle reinforcement of the prisoner's diminished agency. The rhythm became internalized, so that even absent external signals, men could anticipate the sequence of labor, fatigue, and rest, the patterns ingrained by months of repeated exposure to these mechanical, impersonal sounds. The monotony of labor also altered memory. Events outside the camp faded, memories of laughter, festivals, conversation, or music receded under the weight of relentless auditory repetition. The mind, conditioned to attend primarily to rhythm and task, relegated prior experience to a distant, almost dreamlike quality. Emotional responses to joy, surprise, or wonder were dulled, replaced by an automatic endurance that allowed the body and mind to function in a landscape dominated by repetition, observation, and necessity. The psychological landscape of the camp, shaped in part by this constant soundscape, became an environment in which hope itself was muted. Men ceased to dream in the conventional sense, their minds conditioned to anticipate labor and observation rather than freedom or pleasure. Memory and imagination were subordinated to survival. The sound of work, once external, became internalized, echoing in moments of rest, in fevered nights, and in the silent contemplation of the barracks. In this auditory vacuum, the prisoners learned to endure, their awareness shaped less by choice than by necessity, by the omnipresence of labor's rhythm and the absence of any other stimulus to anchor the mind to a pre-war reality. Even moments of potential reprieve, brief pauses in work, the sparse and hurried consumption of rations, or the fleeting opportunity to huddle for warmth, were absorbed into the soundscape. The hiss of wind, the clatter of utensils, and the coughs of the sick reminded men that rest was not escape but part of the continuous cycle. Awareness of this omnipresent rhythm, of labor, oversight, and environmental stresses, cultivated a form of mental resilience, though it was a resilience shaped by monotony rather than hope, by necessity rather than aspiration. Ultimately, the music of the camp, composed of hammering, sawing, chains, groans, and coughs, became a defining characteristic of life behind wire. It was pervasive, inescapable, and transformative, shaping not only perception but identity, recalibrating both thought and emotion to the demands of survival. Laughter, once ordinary and spontaneous, became almost unimaginable, a memory that faded with each passing repetition, replaced by the mechanical acceptance of the world's structure and the bodily and psychological discipline it demanded. The sound of work, relentless and unyielding, was more than background noise. It was a tool of adaptation, a force that numbed both pain and hope. Each swing of a shovel, each clatter of stone, each cough or groan reinforced the parameters of endurance. Men became attuned to rhythm, to repetition, to the predictable sequence of effort and observation. In this environment, the very concept of expectation or joy became secondary to the imperatives of survival, shaped as much by sound as by hunger, cold, and the silent vigilance of the guards. By the end of each day, when labor ceased and the prisoners returned to their barracks, the echoes persisted in memory. Hammering, sawing, coughing, and chains were not only external realities, but internalized measures of existence. The monotony had seeped into thought itself, defining time, perception, and the narrow horizon of possible action. Hope and pain alike were filtered through this auditory lens, rendered abstract, muted, and distant, leaving the mind capable of enduring even the most relentless physical and psychological torments. The prisoners carried memories of home like fragile artifacts, worn smooth by repetition, yet fragile enough to be reshaped by hunger, frost, and labor. Occasionally murmurs swept through the camp, word that a letter might have arrived, that news from family had reached the gates, or that someone in a distant town had sent a small package. Such rumors ignited sparks of hope, brief flickers that illuminated the dim corridors of exhaustion and deprivation, only to be snuffed out by the same indifferent machinery that governed daily life. For every whispered promise of correspondence, the reality was starkly different. Letters were delayed, lost, or never sent at all, and the disappointment fell upon men already weakened, creating a hollow ache that gnawed as insidiously as hunger or disease. In this environment, writing became an act of both necessity and imagination. Prisoners would carve or scrawl messages on scraps of paper, sometimes smuggling words to the guards with the fragile hope that they would eventually reach someone outside the wire. Others wrote simply to preserve sanity, to map the contours of their past, and to hold on to what little remained of identity and memory. Each word was chosen carefully, each line a bridge between the present, dominated by deprivation, and the distant life that existed beyond the barbed fences. The act of writing itself was a rhythm, a private ritual of creation in a world where nearly all action was dictated by external authority. The letters, however, rarely arrived at their destinations. Bureaucracy, war, and neglect intervened with mechanical efficiency. When the prisoners received news, it was often fragmented, outdated, or unintelligible, leaving gaps that imagination struggled to fill. They would reconstruct messages from scraps of text, from the shapes of envelopes, or from the faint ink smudges left by time and handling. The mind compensated, inventing words that might have been written, imagining tones, gestures, and the cadence of voices long absent. Memory and hope intertwined, forming a complex, fragile interior world where the impossible became tangible, if only for a moment. The letters that never came became symbols of absence, a representation of all that had been lost. Each empty day without news reinforced the sense of isolation, amplifying the distance between prisoner and world. Men would sit in the cold, holding scraps of paper they intended to write upon, hands shaking with both fatigue and longing. Faces of loved ones would emerge in their minds, carefully reconstructed and idealized, sometimes indistinguishable from the imagined versions that filled the letters they wrote but never sent. The act of writing became a private dialogue, a conversation with absence itself, as though the words could transcend the fences, the guards, and the machinery of war. Hunger, frost, and labor combined to deepen the poignancy of this ritual. Hands stiffened from cold, weakened from malnutrition, struggled to grip pen or pencil. Ink ran thin or faded. Paper tore in the process of writing. Yet even these physical obstacles could not deter the act. The need to reach beyond immediate suffering, to reassert the self against the eroding forces of the camp, was more urgent than the frailty of the body. Each letter was a small assertion of humanity, a defiance of the camp's machinery, a reminder that the interior life could persist even when the exterior was systematically dismantled. Men would read and reread words they had written, tracing lines with fingers, memorizing phrases, and whispering imagined conversations aloud when alone in the barracks. The letters became talismans, carrying the weight of memory, desire, and longing. Faces remembered from childhood, siblings, spouses, children, friends, all were resurrected in ink and imagination, each stroke a fragile bridge across the relentless gap imposed by captivity. Even when hope faded, the act of writing and remembering persisted, a testament to resilience in the face of erasure. The psychological impact of letters, both received and imagined, was profound. The fleeting hope they carried offered a temporary reprieve from monotony, hunger, and frost, creating a rhythm of anticipation and disappointment that marked the passage of time in the camp. Even the anticipation of letters that never arrived allowed prisoners to project themselves beyond the wire, to imagine a world where love, memory, and normalcy still existed. These mental journeys, though brief and fragile, sustained the psyche, providing a counterbalance to the relentless erasure imposed by labor, disease, and indifference. In many cases, the act of writing was entirely internalized. Prisoners would compose letters mentally, imagining the sentences, phrases, and signatures as though they were in actual correspondence. These imaginary letters, crafted with precision and care, became exercises in memory, moral assertion, and emotional survival. Men would rehearse reading them aloud, whispering words to themselves or mouthing phrases silently, embedding the voices of loved ones in their consciousness. The line between imagination and reality blurred. The letters were simultaneously absent and vividly present, a duality that provided both comfort and pain. The emotional landscape created by letters, whether real or imagined, was intertwined with the ongoing physical and psychological pressures of camp life. Men oscillated between hope and despair, joy and resignation, anticipation and acceptance of absence. The mind, under duress, learned to accommodate both states, holding them in tension without collapse. Letters became more than communication. They were a mechanism of psychological endurance, a way to maintain connection, identity, and a sense of continuity across a world that sought to strip all three away. Even small interactions could evoke the presence of letters. Whispered rumors of incoming mail, the passing of a scrap of paper from one prisoner to another, or the observation of a fellow prisoner carefully protecting a written note, created ripples of shared understanding. These moments reinforced the interior worlds that prisoners constructed for themselves, reminding them that thought, memory, and hope could exist even in the midst of material deprivation. The act of imagining and preserving words became a subtle form of resistance, asserting a private autonomy in a setting designed to obliterate agency. In the absence of correspondence, memory became a proxy for letters. Prisoners recalled details of daily life, gestures, voices, and events with meticulous care, reconstructing the past in increasingly vivid detail. Each recollection, like a letter never sent, became an artifact of identity, a piece of the self preserved against the relentless erasure of camp life. Even as time stretched interminably, these mental constructs provided a fragile continuity, linking the prisoner's present suffering with a past that remained real in memory and a future that could only be imagined. The contrast between the imagined letters and the harshness of camp life heightened the poignancy of each act of remembrance. Snow, frost, hunger, disease, and labor formed an unrelenting backdrop against which these interior rituals unfolded. The act of writing or recalling became a defiance of physical and psychological oppression, a private declaration that life, memory, and affection could not be fully extinguished. Even the smallest imagined details, a smile, a touch, a shared laugh, became anchors of resilience, faint signals of human continuity in a landscape dominated by deprivation. Isolation amplified the need for letters. In moments when prisoners were alone, during frost-bitten dawns, brief lulls in labor, or sleepless nights, the mind turned compulsively to recollection and writing. Faces, voices, and the cadence of speech became rehearsed, repeated, and preserved. These private rituals, silent and invisible to others, were a lifeline, a means of asserting personhood and resisting the gradual dissolution imposed by hunger, disease, labor, and the indifferent vigilance of guards. In the end, letters that never came and the mental acts of writing became central to the prisoners' interior lives. They were more than symbols of connection. They were instruments of survival, carrying memory, identity, and hope across the chasm of captivity. Through them, men preserved fragments of humanity, sustaining themselves against the gradual erosion imposed by wire, frost, labor, and indifference. In a world designed to erase, these acts of communication, real, imagined, or internalized, were declarations that even in absence, presence could persist, and even in silence, voices could endure. The passage of time within the camp became a phenomenon untethered from conventional markers. Days merged seamlessly into nights, and months dissolved into a continuum, defined only by the repetition of labor, observation, hunger, and cold. The sun, when visible, appeared pale and distant, casting weak light across the snow, mud, or dust that marked the camp's terrain. There were no festivals, no holidays, no celebrations to punctuate the relentless rhythm. The prisoners came to measure time not in days or weeks but in tasks completed, rations consumed, or the subtle changes in the cold or frost, the gradual weakening of a neighbor, the coughing that grew louder or more ragged, and the slowly lengthening shadows of the barracks. Each hour stretched interminably, every movement a reminder that the present, and the act of enduring it, had become the entirety of existence. Memory, once a reliable anchor, began to erode under the weight of monotony, deprivation, and constant observation. Men struggled to recall sequences of events, conversations, or even personal details from before captivity. Faces of friends and family blurred, names became difficult to summon, and the past began to exist less as a series of lived experiences and more as a collection of impressions, fragments of emotion, or fleeting mental images. Memories were preserved selectively, often coalescing around comfort, warmth, or sustenance, while other recollections faded, unable to compete with the pressing immediacy of hunger, frostbite, or labor. Time itself became plastic, bending and stretching in accordance with the demands of survival rather than any external calendar. The camp imposed a rhythm that was both oppressive and hypnotic. The repetitive tasks of labor, roll calls, inspections, and returns to barracks dictated the prisoner's experience of the day. Every sound, every motion, every glance from a guard or neighbor was absorbed into a routine that required constant vigilance. Sleep, when it came, was shallow and fragmented, punctuated by the cold, coughs, groans, and the occasional harsh call of authority. Even in these moments of rest, time seemed suspended, flowing more slowly than natural perception would dictate. Days could pass unnoticed, hours consumed in silent calculation of steps, breath, and effort, until the boundaries between one day and the next were almost indistinguishable. Survival began to dominate consciousness to such a degree that other forms of thought became peripheral. The mind trained itself to operate on instinct and observation rather than reflection or planning. Decisions were reduced to the immediate and practical: when to move, when to eat, when to conserve warmth, when to avoid notice. Higher-level abstractions, hope for freedom, consideration of the future, reflection on the past became luxuries, distracting from the pressing needs imposed by the environment. This mental narrowing was a necessary adaptation, an unconscious pruning of thought to optimize endurance, yet it carried with it a subtle erosion of individuality and memory. In this environment, the boundaries of self also began to blur. The relentless repetition of tasks, the monotony of observation, and the constant demands of survival gradually dissolved distinctions between individual prisoners. Men were aware of themselves primarily as functioning bodies, as elements within the camp's system, rather than as autonomous actors with histories, relationships, or ambitions. Names and ranks mattered less than capacity for labor, stamina, and compliance. Personal identity in this sense became secondary to function, to the ability to persist within the structural confines imposed by wire labor, frost, and disease. Sleep became an unstable measure of time. Nights stretched, elongated by discomfort, cold, and illness. Men shifted restlessly on straw bedding, curling into themselves to preserve warmth, their bodies echoing the external world's harsh geometry of cold, wire, and rigid discipline. Dreams, when they arrived, were often fragmented, interweaving memories of the past with hallucinations born of fever, hunger, or cold. The distinction between reality and recollection became increasingly tenuous, as the brain attempted to reconcile fragmented memory with the unrelenting pressures of the present. Consciousness itself became a series of punctuated moments, small victories of perception and endurance amid the slow erosion of mental continuity. Companionship, though fragile, persisted in altered forms. Men huddled together for warmth, exchanged brief nods or gestures, and quietly shared rations or whispered fragments of encouragement. Yet these connections were heavily mediated by the relentless rhythm of survival. There was little room for sustained conversation, playful interaction, or emotional intimacy. Every engagement was weighed against the cost to energy, warmth, or attention. Friendships, when they existed, were practical as much as emotional, sustained by shared strategies for enduring labor, frost, hunger, and illness rather than by free choice or leisure. The passage of time, however, gradually eroded even these fragile bonds, as men succumbed to exhaustion, disease, or the subtle psychological effects of monotony. Within the camp, sensory perception adapted to the slow dissolution of days. Eyes became attuned to minute variations in light and shadow, ears to subtle shifts in sound that signaled orders, danger, or opportunity. Smells and textures, once incidental, assumed significance as indicators of food, illness, or environmental threat. These heightened sensory attentions, however, came at the cost of broader awareness. Thoughts, reflections, and memories of life beyond the wire faded, leaving consciousness focused almost entirely on immediate survival. Time in this sense became both compressed and elongated. Compressed in terms of attention and cognition, elongated in terms of subjective experience, stretching minutes into seeming hours and days into indistinguishable blocks of endurance. Rituals became the only markers of continuity. Roll calls, ration distribution, labor assignments, and inspections were the camp's only temporal scaffolding. These events were predictable, mechanical, and repeated with precise regularity. The prisoners relied on them to orient themselves, to understand the flow of hours and days, to gauge progress through an otherwise amorphous temporal landscape. Yet even these structures, while reliable, were insufficient to anchor memory or create a sense of linear time. Days passed in a slow haze, each indistinguishable from the next, punctuated by labor, observation, and the bodily processes of survival. The eroding sense of time also affected planning and imagination. Men ceased to anticipate beyond the immediate task. Thoughts of escape, reunion, or life after the camp became increasingly abstract, almost dreamlike, existing at the edges of consciousness rather than as actionable plans. Memory and imagination both became tools for momentary respite rather than sustained projection. Men would briefly recall a shared meal at home, a conversation, a landscape, or a song, but these recollections were fleeting, fragile, and easily overtaken by the pressing demands of the present. Psychological resilience became intertwined with the ability to lose track of days. Forgetting, in a sense, was protective. It allowed men to endure repetition without succumbing entirely to despair. Yet this very adaptation carried subtle dangers. As the past receded and the future became nearly inconceivable, identity and continuity eroded alongside memory. Men existed increasingly as functional beings, their interior lives dominated by instinct, habit, and the steady rhythm of labor, observation, cold and hunger. Emotional life narrowed, limited to essential responses: the avoidance of danger, the conservation of energy, the management of cold, the negotiation of labor, and the preservation of fragile companionship. The monotony and dissolution of time transformed space as well. Barracks, fences, labor fields, and frozen paths became not merely physical locations but temporal anchors, reference points in a world otherwise without markers. Movement across the camp was measured not by distance but by routine. The path from barracks to labor, labor to barracks, the positioning at roll call, the shifting of straw during rest. Each step, each repetition was absorbed into the mind as a unit of time, a metric by which the passing hours could be conceptualized, however crudely. Even in the rare moments of reflection, memory was unreliable, refracted through the lens of deprivation, cold, disease, and monotony. The mind smoothed the edges of past experience, softening details of home, war, or personal history. What remained were emotional traces: warmth, fear, longing, or regret, rather than concrete recollections. Time, then, was experienced primarily as a sequence of states: labor, rest, cold, hunger, observation, companionship, and endurance. These states, repeated with unyielding regularity, substituted for the chronological flow that had once structured life outside the wire. Ultimately, the prisoner's existence became almost entirely instinctive. Awareness focused on survival, conserving energy, preserving warmth, maintaining enough strength for labor, avoiding notice from guards, sustaining companions in small ways, and warding off illness. The mind and body functioned in a delicate balance, responding to cues in the environment and to the rhythms of the camp rather than to conscious choice. Past and future were largely inaccessible. The present, in all its harshness and repetition, became the entirety of reality. In this state, the camp imposed a form of timelessness, a slow dissolution in which survival replaced narrative, repetition replaced memory, and instinct replaced hope. Days, weeks, and months were experienced as a continuous expanse of endurance. The boundaries between one day and the next, one season and another, and even one year and the next became indistinct. Men existed as components within a system of survival, their interior lives structured by repetition, cold, hunger, labor, observation, and fragile companionship, rather than by chronological markers. Thus, the disappearing days created a psychological landscape in which memory faded, perception narrowed, and survival became instinctive. The past and future existed only as distant, fleeting shadows. The present was absolute, all-encompassing, and unrelenting. In this environment, the prisoners learned to move, act, and endure without reliance on conventional measures of time, letting the rhythm of the camp, rather than the calendar or the sun, define every moment of life behind the wire. The shadow of torture stretched across the camp not as an extraordinary event, but as a constant, quiet presence that threaded itself through the daily lives of the prisoners. Unlike the sudden explosions of battle or the dramatic violence of war, the cruelty here was slow, methodical, and bureaucratically integrated into the rhythm of camp life. Interrogations, beatings, forced confessions, and the subtle manipulations of authority occurred not as expressions of rage, but as mechanical exercises of control, designed to enforce compliance, weaken resistance, and maintain order. The horror lay not in their intensity, which varied from day to day, but in their inevitability, their repetition, and the way they became almost invisible in the daily landscape of deprivation. The body and mind became acclimated to pain, suffering was catalogued as a fact of life, and cruelty lost its shock, taking on the eerie guise of routine. Interrogations were a theatre of endurance, conducted with meticulous attention to procedure. Guards and officers followed established scripts, questioning prisoners in repetitive patterns, seeking confessions, extracting information, or simply reinforcing the hierarchy of authority. The questions themselves were often banal, the cadence deliberate, yet each word carried the potential for punishment, a blow, or prolonged discomfort. Men subjected to these processes learned quickly to anticipate the patterns, to anticipate the pauses, the tone of voice, the subtle gestures that signaled escalation or reprieve. The mind became trained to survive the ritual rather than to understand its logic, to endure the mechanical cruelty rather than to respond emotionally, and to internalize the lesson that resistance, whether mental or verbal, could produce only suffering. Beatings were similarly routine. They were meted out according to schedules, guidelines, or perceived infractions, often without verbal explanation or immediate provocation. A misaligned uniform, a slow response to command, or a faltering in labor could trigger physical punishment, applied with a precision that left little room for negotiation. The body learned to anticipate these occurrences, muscles tensed in advance, and the mind compartmentalized the resulting pain. Shock and horror, initially visceral and acute, gave way to a resigned awareness. The pain was inevitable, predictable, and to be endured. Over time, the brutality became part of the fabric of daily life, losing its extraordinary status and becoming a normalized dimension of existence. Psychological cruelty operated in subtler, yet equally potent ways. The prisoners were subjected to manipulation, threats, and the erosion of hope through both explicit and implied means. Men were reminded repeatedly of the futility of resistance, the improbability of escape, and the indifference of the outside world. Gossip about executions, rumors of punishment, and the arbitrary selection of individuals for reprisal became instruments of fear, not because of direct violence, but because of their capacity to instill a continuous, pervasive anxiety. The mind under these conditions learned to predict, anticipate, and absorb the mechanisms of control, even as it struggled to retain a sense of self and continuity in an environment designed to diminish both. The camp's physical spaces themselves became extensions of cruelty. Interrogation rooms, punishment cells, and isolated corners were configured for maximum psychological impact. Sparse lighting, unyielding surfaces, and the deliberate placement of objects all contributed to an environment in which discomfort, anxiety, and submission were enforced without overt violence. Men entered these spaces aware that endurance, not argument, would determine survival, and they exited carrying the invisible weight of anticipation, memory, and fear into the next phase of their constrained lives. The repetition of cruelty had an insidious effect on perception. Pain, both physical and psychological, became normalized. Muscles and nerves, once capable of acute response, adapted to regular infliction. Emotional reactions were dulled, as shock and outrage were metabolized into endurance. Even empathy among prisoners was tempered by the pervasive presence of suffering. Men learned to moderate expressions of distress, both to conserve energy and to avoid drawing the attention of guards. In this way, cruelty became an ambient condition, present not only in acts of violence, but also in silence, observation, and the predictable, impersonal enforcement of authority. Witnessing cruelty inflicted upon others reinforced its ordinariness. Guards, in their mechanical execution of orders, treated punishment as a necessary instrument rather than an emotional statement. The same procedures applied to many prisoners, repeatedly, without deviation. Men observing the beatings of their companions internalized the lesson. The machinery was impartial in method, relentless in repetition, and indifferent to personal circumstance. Empathy persisted. but it was framed through endurance, observation, and the quiet acknowledgement of systemic oppression rather than hope for intervention or reprieve. Sleep offered little refuge from the shadow of torture. The mind, conditioned to anticipate arbitrary punishment, became hyper-aware of sounds, movements, and signals that might indicate attention from guards. The creak of boots on frozen ground, the faint whistle of wind through the wire, or the scrape of a baton against the barracks floor could provoke sudden alertness, even at night. Dreams were infrequent, fragmented, or populated by distorted reflections of daily experiences, beatings, interrogations, labor, and observation. The body, exhausted by the physical demands of survival, remained tense, as if anticipating pain even in repose. In this way, cruelty infiltrated consciousness beyond the moments of direct interaction, becoming a continuous, almost invisible, aspect of existence. Over time, the normalization of cruelty transformed social dynamics among prisoners. Expressions of fear, distress, or dissent were measured, moderated, and sometimes suppressed entirely. Men learned to navigate the environment not by strength or resistance, but by subtle observation, strategic adaptation, and endurance. Companionship persisted, but it was shaped by shared understanding of cruelty's patterns rather than by spontaneous emotional engagement. Solidarity became pragmatic, conserving warmth, sharing minimal rations, protecting one another from avoidable punishment, and maintaining silence when necessary. Emotional bonds were filtered through the lens of survival, tempered by the omnipresence of methodical pain. Even minor infractions were amplified in significance under the shadow of torture. A stumble during labor, a misaligned article of clothing, or a delayed response to command could trigger a disproportionate response. The predictability of the system allowed the mind to anticipate, yet anticipation itself became a source of exhaustion. Psychological energy was continuously allocated to monitoring behavior, predicting outcomes, and managing both internal responses and external appearance. In this way, the camp's cruelty extended beyond moments of physical punishment, influencing thought, emotion, and behavior in a pervasive, almost invisible manner. The bureaucratic nature of torture further reinforced its mundanity. Procedures, schedules, and regulations dictated the timing, method, and intensity of punishment. Officers and guards executed these directives with precision, rarely deviating, rarely expressing emotion. Pain became standardized, depersonalized, and expected. The prisoners learned that survival depended not on appeal or resistance, but on careful observation, compliance, and the quiet cultivation of endurance. The extraordinary violence of battle had been replaced by a slow, unrelenting erosion of body and spirit, administered with procedural calm and applied with unflinching regularity. The psychological consequences were profound. Men became attuned to subtle cues of impending pain, learning to predict, internalize, and manage fear. Resilience was forged not in the absence of cruelty, but in its continuous presence, which gradually reshaped perception, reaction, and cognition. Emotional response became muted, replaced by analytical awareness and strategic adaptation. The mind learned to accept the inevitability of pain, to navigate the rhythms of punishment, and to preserve what remained of autonomy through careful observation and internal regulation. The ordinariness of cruelty also created a paradoxical form of temporal compression. Days filled with interrogations, beatings, and psychological torment passed with a dual sense of prolongation and condensation. Each act was lengthy in experience, yet repetitive enough to blur into the overall rhythm of existence. Memory of individual acts became fragmented, while their cumulative effect carved deep psychological grooves, shaping identity, behavior, and the perception of time itself. Cruelty became not merely an external imposition, but an internalized reality, woven seamlessly into the fabric of life behind the wire. Through repeated exposure, prisoners developed strategies of mental detachment. Observation of cruelty, either experienced directly or witnessed, was mediated by compartmentalization. The body endured, the mind analyzed, and emotion was rationed. This was not triumph over suffering, nor denial of pain, but a mechanism for survival. By integrating the constant presence of methodical violence into an internalized understanding of the camp's logic, men created a cognitive buffer against despair, even as their spirits were incrementally eroded. Thus, in the shadow of torture, cruelty became mundane, predictable, and almost invisible in its repetition. It was administered not as spectacle or outrage, but as a structural component of the camp, as routine as labor, frost, or hunger. Pain and fear were present, persistent and unavoidable, yet their extraordinary qualities faded with constant exposure. The mind adapted, the body endured, and survival depended on mastering not the avoidance of cruelty, but the quiet, steady navigation of its relentless and bureaucratic presence. The prisoners confronted daily with hunger, frost, labor, disease, and cruelty began to discover that the only sanctuary left was the mind itself. With the relentless pressure of the camp compressing every aspect of existence into a narrow externalized routine, consciousness turned inward, seeking refuge where the body could not. Dreams, once ephemeral and largely subconscious, became vivid and intentional, acting as private theaters in which memories, fantasies, and desires could unfold unobserved. Imagination, untethered by the rigid hierarchy of the camp, became the only domain in which autonomy could still exist. Men retreated into the corners of their memory, reconstructing landscapes of home, recalling the faces and voices of loved ones, and reimagining moments of warmth, safety, and freedom with painstaking detail. These inner worlds, though fragile and fleeting, offered a form of psychological sustenance that even the most brutal routines could not entirely extinguish. The process of retreating into the mind was gradual. At first it emerged as fleeting mental escapes, a remembered meal, a song from childhood, the image of a sunlit river. These brief departures from the immediate suffering were precious and rare, flickers of personal identity preserved amid an environment that sought to strip individuality. Over time, the necessity of mental retreat deepened, becoming not a luxury but a form of survival. Men learned to cultivate memory and imagination as tools, constructing intricate internal landscapes that could be accessed during the long hours of labor, the frozen nights, or the moments of forced observation. These internal retreats were often structured, deliberate, and repeated, forming a private rhythm that counterbalanced the external monotony and brutality. The mind's retreat took multiple forms. Some prisoners constructed entire mental narratives, reliving past experiences in exhaustive detail, embellishing and expanding them to sustain interest and emotional engagement. Others projected imagined futures, visualizing freedom, reunion, or distant landscapes in such detail that the sensory impressions, the sounds, smells, and textures, felt almost tangible. A man might imagine the soft sway of trees in the wind, the warmth of sunlight on skin, or the taste of food that had long been absent. These imagined experiences were not mere diversions, they were lifelines, exercises of autonomy, in a context where control over the body, the environment, and time had been systematically removed. Isolation magnified both the potency and the danger of the mind's retreat. In the barracks, where individuals huddled for warmth yet were still surrounded by the suffering of others, the mental space offered a form of withdrawal that protected from the immediate pressures of environment and authority. However, these retreats were precarious. Sustained withdrawal from the external world risked disorientation, emotional detachment, and a form of psychic fracturing. Some men found themselves wandering through dreams so vivid that they became unable to reconcile imagined events with reality, blurring the line between memory and hallucination. In such cases, imagination served both as sanctuary and as a double-edged instrument, offering escape while threatening psychological stability. The retreat inward also became a form of resistance, subtle but profound. By preserving an inner life that could not be policed, the prisoners asserted a degree of autonomy in a world designed to eliminate it. Mental landscapes became personal territories, immune to the external mechanisms of control. Within these imagined spaces, men could express agency, feel emotion, and make choices unconstrained by the physical and social hierarchies of the camp. They could walk freely, speak openly, laugh, cry, and reconnect with identities that had been suppressed, reduced, or fragmented by the relentless pressures of captivity. Memory played a central role in this psychological survival. Prisoners reconstructed events from before captivity with astonishing fidelity, emphasizing sensory details, relational dynamics, and emotional textures. The smells of a kitchen, the sound of a loved one's voice, the texture of familiar furniture, and the light at a particular hour became tools for sustaining internal coherence. Memory was not static, it was actively reconstructed, elaborated, and occasionally idealized, filling gaps with imagination where factual recall had failed. This reconstruction allowed men to maintain a coherent sense of self, a thread of identity stretching from past to present, and a fragile anchor of humanity amid systematic dehumanization. Some prisoners turned to creative mental exercises as part of their retreat. Imagining conversations, crafting narratives, or reconstructing lost skills became methods of occupying the mind and maintaining intellectual engagement. The construction of intricate scenarios, including imagined journeys, games, or even architectural projects, provided cognitive stimulation and emotional engagement. In these moments, the mind reclaimed control over narrative and environment, transforming mental activity into a tool for endurance, resistance, and the preservation of sanity. The retreat inward was also a mechanism for coping with repeated trauma. Observing or experiencing beatings, frost, hunger, and disease created cumulative psychological burdens that threatened mental stability. By withdrawing into memory, imagination, or dreams, prisoners could partially insulate themselves from external harm. These retreats provided temporary reprieves in which the mind could rest, reorganize, and process experiences without being overwhelmed. While such mental strategies could not eliminate suffering, they offered a buffer, slowing the erosion of psychological integrity and allowing men to endure day after day, month after month, behind the wire. Even the most mundane aspects of camp life were transformed within the inner world. A ration of bread could become a feast, a patch of sunlight on a frozen morning could expand into a full landscape of warmth, and the sound of a distant cough could be interpreted in narrative, memory, or creative imagination. These mental translations of external stimuli enabled prisoners to reclaim meaning in an environment where meaning had been largely stripped away. Every observation, every sensation, and every fragment of memory could be repurposed into a form of inner autonomy, a mental expansion that contrasted starkly with the physical constraints imposed by the camp. The internal retreat also fostered a quiet sense of continuity across time. With memory and imagination serving as anchors, prisoners were able to maintain an ongoing narrative of self, linking past experiences with imagined futures. Even as the external world flattened into repetition, monotony, and suffering, the mind retained the capacity for temporal layering, recollection, present awareness, and projection could coexist within internal landscapes. This psychological layering created resilience, allowing men to endure even when all markers of chronological and spatial continuity had been stripped away by the camp's machinery. Social interaction, when it occurred, was also influenced by these internal retreats. Companions might exchange brief gestures, share scraps of memory, or convey imagined scenarios in hushed tones. In these exchanges, imagination became communal, fragments of memory and fantasy were reinforced, expanded, and validated by the recognition of others. Yet the retreat remained largely personal and inward-focused. Full expression, full recreation of identity remained unattainable in the external world. Imagination was a private, protected domain, immune to intrusion, judgment, or interference. Even despair and mental strain were shaped by this internalization. Moments of hopelessness, fear, or grief could be moderated by the capacity to withdraw, by the ability to inhabit an imagined world where control, freedom, and identity remained intact. In some cases, however, the retreat inward blurred the boundary between survival and madness. Repetitive mental constructs, hallucinated conversations, or vivid, distorted recollections could erode the prisoner's sense of present reality, creating an oscillation between clarity and disorientation. Yet even in these extreme cases, the mind's retreat provided a lifeline, a means to endure what the body and external environment threatened to overwhelm. The psychological strategies of retreat were supported by sensory recall. The feel of clothing, the texture of bread, the faint warmth of a fire, and even smells preserved in memory could be called upon to construct immersive mental environments. These sensory reconstructions lent vividness to imagined scenes, enabling a richer and more sustaining internal life. Prisoners would manipulate these inputs deliberately, extending the warmth of a remembered sunbeam, heightening the scent of a garden, or amplifying the sound of a loved one's voice. Through these exercises, imagination became a tool for emotional regulation and a mechanism for sustaining endurance in a world stripped of comfort. By retreating into the mind, prisoners preserved what was untouchable by the camp: identity, autonomy, imagination and memory. Hunger, frost, labor, disease and cruelty could shape, deform, and assault the body and external perception, but they could not fully extinguish the internal landscapes that men cultivated with care and precision. In the absence of freedom, these inner worlds became the only domain in which agency and choice could flourish. Survival, therefore, became as much an exercise in mental creation as in physical endurance, with imagination functioning as a sanctuary against the erasure of captivity. Ultimately, the retreat inward exemplified both vulnerability and resilience. It demonstrated how, even in a system designed to destroy, the human mind could preserve agency, continuity, and a measure of freedom. Through dreams, memory, and imagination, prisoners maintained an inner universe immune to the machinery of the camp. These private worlds provided sustenance, identity, and protection, transforming the very act of thinking into an instrument of survival. In a realm dominated by deprivation and control, the mind became the last frontier of autonomy, a quiet, persistent testament to human endurance. Amid the pervasive deprivation, cold, labor, and relentless observation, prisoners began to forge connections that were as subtle as they were vital, human bonds that did not require words, explanations, or ceremony to exist. In a world designed to strip identity and erode individuality, these flickers of connection became lifelines, small acts of mutual recognition and care that sustained both body and spirit. A glance exchanged across a labor field, a crumb of bread passed discreetly, the barely perceptible tilt of the head in acknowledgement. These gestures carried weight far beyond their apparent simplicity. They were acts of defiance, tiny assertions of humanity, and reminders that even in a landscape dominated by wire, frost, disease, and cruelty, the essential capacity to recognize, nurture, and empathize with another could survive. Friendships in this environment did not rely on prolonged conversation or overt displays of emotion. Speech was dangerous, monitored, and often unnecessary. A whispered name, a shared glance, or the subtle timing of movement could communicate volumes. Two men might coordinate during labor without ever speaking, shifting posture or adjusting pace to lighten each other's burden. In the barracks, warmth was shared silently, bodies pressed close against the cold, and hands brushed together in the act of distributing scarce clothing or rations. The bonds were practical in their inception, grounded in survival, but over time they acquired a faintly emotional dimension, a quiet reassurance that one was not entirely alone. The act of sharing, even in such minimal forms, carried profound significance. A piece of bread, a scrap of clothing, or a whispered warning of approaching guards could be the difference between temporary relief and suffering. These gestures, small as they were, became ritualized, repeated, and understood among companions as tokens of trust and mutual dependence. Men measured each other not by social rank, nationality, or past status, but by reliability, attentiveness, and capacity to care within the extreme constraints of the camp. The acts themselves were often unnoticed by the authorities, occurring in the margins of labor lines, during roll calls, or in the brief intervals between punishment and observation. Silence became a language of its own. In a setting where speech could provoke attention, punishment, or scrutiny, the quiet forms of communication were safer and more intimate. Eyes could convey encouragement, resolve, or warning. A tilt of the head or a simple nod could communicate agreement, empathy, or solidarity. The prisoners became attuned to these subtle cues, learning to read gestures, postures, and glances with precision. In doing so, they built a web of mutual understanding that was largely invisible to the external world, but profoundly sustaining within their interior experience. Shared endurance itself became a form of companionship. Labor, ration lines, inspections, and the harsh environment of frost and disease created circumstances in which men observed and responded to each other's suffering continuously. The act of noticing another's struggle, adjusting behavior to ease it slightly, or offering discreet assistance constituted a bond that transcended words. These acts reinforced the idea that survival was not merely individual, but relational, and that even in the most oppressive environment, care could be expressed through presence, attentiveness, and minute, almost imperceptible gestures. There was also a ritualized rhythm to these bonds. Over months and years, the silent exchanges became patterned, forming an unspoken language of survival and connection. Men would learn to anticipate each other's needs, to recognize gestures of distress or fatigue, and to respond in ways that required neither speech nor explanation. The predictability of these exchanges offered comfort, a reminder that within the chaos, a small order of human concern could be maintained. Even fleeting contact, repeated regularly, provided psychological reinforcement that life persisted in some recognizable form despite the erosion of freedom, identity, and security. In the context of scarcity, the moral and emotional weight of these small acts intensified. A shared crust of bread, a hidden ration, or a coat lent for warmth could carry disproportionate significance. Each act was both practical and symbolic, reinforcing bonds of trust, mutual recognition, and survival. The prisoners, having endured systematic dehumanization, were reminded that even when stripped of property, privacy, and autonomy, the capacity to act with care remained intact. These gestures became acts of resistance, asserting humanity and dignity within a system designed to negate both. Observation also reinforced companionship. Simply noticing that another person was alive, breathing, and moving through the same oppressive landscape created a quiet acknowledgement of shared existence. Men would follow each other's progress through labor lines, mark the rhythm of coughing and groaning, or recall the absence of a familiar presence. The return of a companion after illness, frostbite, or punishment was a small, tangible reinforcement of relational continuity, a faint reassurance that survival could be collective, even when fragile. The bonds of silence shaped the emotional landscape of the camp in subtle ways. Fear, exhaustion, and despair were ever present, but these small connections provided intermittent relief, a flicker of warmth in a world dominated by deprivation. Companions served as mirrors, reflecting persistence, endurance, and identity back to each other. The silent sharing of experience reinforced the notion that one's existence mattered, that even the most minimal acts of attention and care could preserve a sense of self and continuity. Over time, these relationships became intertwined with memory and imagination. Prisoners would mentally revisit small moments of connection, the brief exchange of bread, the touch of a shoulder, or a glance across a labor field, using them as anchors in otherwise monotonous and dehumanizing days. These recollections were rehearsed, embellished, and cherished, transforming into private reservoirs of warmth and reassurance. The mind's retreat inward, discussed previously, intersected with silent companionship, creating layers of psychological sustenance that helped individuals endure the relentless pressures of the camp. Companionship also carried a temporal dimension. Knowing that someone would be present during labor, during roll call, or in the barracks created continuity in an otherwise disjointed and fluctuating world. Anticipation of brief interaction, even minimal and silent, provided structure to the disappearing days, offering a sense of rhythm, expectation, and relational stability. The prisoners learned to measure part of their experience not in terms of rations, labor, or punishment, but through these enduring, almost imperceptible social markers. Even the emotional language of touch became subtle, codified, and ritualized. The brush of hands when passing clothing or food, the adjustment of blankets in shared sleeping areas, or the simple act of leaning close for warmth conveyed care, protection, and solidarity. These gestures were intentional yet quiet, calibrated to maintain dignity and minimize risk while maximizing psychological and physical benefit. In the absence of conventional forms of emotional expression, such tactile communication became vital, sustaining bonds of trust, hope, and shared endurance. The bonds of silence also provided a counterweight to isolation and despair. In a camp where cruelty was routine and monotony dominated, these small gestures of connection reminded prisoners that they were not alone in experience, perception, or endurance. Even minimal recognition of shared suffering was sufficient to preserve a sense of relational reality, a thread of humanity that persisted despite deprivation, frost, hunger, disease, and observation. These connections functioned as anchors, stabilizing the mind and providing a subtle but persistent reinforcement of resilience. In this context, friendships existed not for pleasure or social convention, but for survival, moral support, and the preservation of identity. They were acts of quiet defiance, proof that humanity could endure where systems sought to erase it. The gestures were mournful in their minimalism, often overshadowed by the daily pressures of survival, yet warm in their persistence, a faint flickering affirmation that connection, empathy, and care could survive, even amid relentless despair. Ultimately, the bonds of silence revealed the tenacity of human spirit. They demonstrated that even in extreme deprivation, subtle acts of recognition and care could preserve dignity, identity, and connection. Through shared glances, whispered names, gestures, and attention, prisoners reclaimed fragments of autonomy, continuity, and relational depth. Humanity, though constrained, flickered persistently beneath the surface of suffering, creating a delicate but enduring network of mutual sustenance and psychological survival. Whispers began to circulate in the frozen corridors and barracks of the camp, carrying fragments of news from beyond the wire. These rumors, often unverified and distorted by repetition, spoke of distant battles, the progress of Allied forces, and the possibility that the balance of the war might shift. Men listened with varying degrees of skepticism and desire, leaning into any suggestion that their suffering could one day end. The rumors moved like ghosts, passing from one prisoner to another, always tentative, always incomplete, yet carrying a peculiar weight. The mere possibility of change, of an altered world beyond the fences, was enough to stir both longing and fear. In a space defined by monotony and deprivation, the mind seized upon these hints as a form of sustenance, a rare intrusion of the outside world into a realm otherwise cut off from temporal and geographic reality. The tone of these whispers was cautious, measured, almost ritualistic. Prisoners passed information quietly, aware that guards might intercept or punish open discussion. Rumors were often shared in hushed tones, during brief moments when oversight was lax, or encoded through gestures, nods, and glances. Despite the fragmentary nature of the reports, each detail became a focus of attention: a city liberated, an army advancing, an enemy retreating. These snippets, uncertain as they were, injected a fragile tension into daily existence. Hope was awakened, but it was tempered by the ever-present risk of disappointment. Men knew the dangers of investing too heavily in the possibility of freedom. Past absences of news had hardened them to optimism, and the line between belief and delusion was perilously thin. Hope in the camp was a delicate and double-edged phenomenon. The mental shift it provoked was both sustaining and destabilizing. On one hand, the belief that the war might turn, that external forces could alter the prisoner's fate, provided renewed energy for labor, attention, and endurance. Tasks that had become purely mechanical now carried a subtle symbolic weight. Each step, each stroke of the pick, each completed chore was no longer just survival. but a preparation for a future that might one day arrive. On the other hand, hope created vulnerability. When rumors proved false or expectations went unmet, despair deepened more acutely than before. The prisoners learned to negotiate this emotional tension, holding hope lightly, allowing it to motivate without demanding certainty, balancing anticipation against the constant risk of disappointment. The content of the rumors varied widely, shaped by perception, imagination, and the selective memory of the human mind under stress. A single fragment could transform as it passed along, becoming more dramatic, more optimistic, or more fearful with each repetition. A skirmish reported in a distant city might evolve into a decisive victory in retelling. A minor retreat might become the collapse of entire enemy forces. Prisoners, isolated from reliable sources of information, were forced to navigate a landscape where truth was fluid, yet the emotional impact remained potent. Each rumor carried weight not as factual certainty, but as a catalyst for reflection, memory, and internal projection, a temporary expansion of consciousness beyond the immediate confines of wire, frost, and labor. The psychological effect of hope was profound and pervasive. It altered perception, extending attention beyond the immediate pressures of survival to incorporate the possibility of change. Prisoners found themselves momentarily lifted above the monotony and oppression, imagining liberation, reunion with loved ones, or a world restored to familiar order. Dreams previously constrained by memory or imagination became populated with future possibilities. Men rehearsed scenarios of freedom in detail, walking through streets free of guards, embracing family members, tasting fresh food, or feeling warmth without layers of clothing and frostbite. The mind, long trained to survive in deprivation, now engaged in projection, constructing elaborate simulations of a world that might, just possibly, exist beyond the immediate reality. Yet the tension between hope and fear was omnipresent. Men had experienced loss, deprivation, and betrayal of expectation repeatedly. Any belief in change was therefore accompanied by the anticipatory grief of disappointment. The very act of imagining victory, liberation, or reunion invoked anxiety, as the mind measured the likelihood of the rumor being false against the emotional investment required to sustain belief. Prisoners learned to regulate their responses carefully, balancing engagement with cautious skepticism. Hope was permitted, but always at arm's length, a fragile animal nurtured but never fully trusted, a source of comfort and risk simultaneously. The rhythm of camp life amplified the stakes of these rumors. Daily routines of labor, inspections, roll calls, and rationing continued without alteration, yet every minor event became filtered through the lens of possible change. The arrival of a new guard, a delivery of supplies, or the presence of a transient officer could be interpreted as a harbinger of news, a signal of progress, or a prelude to disappointment. In this way, hope was woven into every movement, every observation, every interaction. The mind was trained to read significance in the small, the subtle, and the ambiguous, transforming ordinary experience into a continual assessment of possibility and risk. The communal aspect of rumor sharing was also significant. When news, verified or not, was whispered between prisoners, it became a shared act of mental and emotional engagement. Companions exchanged fragments, debated interpretations, and rehearsed the potential implications of events far beyond the wire. These shared experiences created a social dimension to hope. It was no longer solely an individual coping mechanism, but a collective negotiation of expectation, fear, and resilience. Even silence, when imbued with the tension of anticipated news, became a form of shared understanding, a communal acknowledgement of longing and possibility. Rumors also affected the physical dimension of endurance. A glimpse of hope could stimulate energy, enhancing performance during labor or alertness during roll call. Conversely, dashed expectations could produce physical manifestations of despair, lethargy, withdrawal, or diminished appetite. The prisoners learned to modulate both physical and psychological responses to the unpredictable arrival of information, creating a delicate equilibrium between expectation and endurance. The body and mind became intertwined in a constant negotiation of energy, anticipation, and emotion. The fragility of hope heightened its significance. A single hint of progress, no matter how small, could dominate consciousness for days. The mind would dwell on possible scenarios, replay imagined conversations, and rehearse responses to liberation, reunion, or external intervention. These mental rehearsals became exercises in agency, allowing prisoners to reclaim a measure of control over a world otherwise defined by deprivation, labor, and observation. In these imagined scenarios, men could act freely, make choices, and experience emotions that were otherwise suppressed, providing temporary relief from the pervasive dehumanization of the camp. Yet the danger of misplaced hope was ever present. Rumors that proved false carried the potential to deepen despair beyond the ordinary levels imposed by camp life. The contrast between imagined possibility and harsh reality created emotional whiplash, intensifying the perception of deprivation, cruelty, and isolation. Prisoners learned to navigate this duality, treating hope as a tentative, conditional state rather than as certainty. This delicate balance between desire and caution shaped the psychological architecture of endurance, teaching men to sustain expectation while guarding against the collapse of morale. In this way, the circulation of rumors became a structural component of camp life. It introduced temporal and emotional complexity into an otherwise repetitive, oppressive environment. The mind, previously constrained to survival, memory, and imagination, now engaged with the possibility of external forces, victory, and liberation. This engagement offered both sustenance and risk, creating an oscillation between cautious optimism and restrained fear. The prisoners, aware of the precariousness of belief, learned to inhabit this tension with care, using it to maintain vigilance, endurance, and a fragile sense of agency. Rumors also served as markers of a world beyond the camp, preserving a connection to temporality, geography, and political events that otherwise seemed distant and abstract. Even fragmented and unreliable, these whispers carried the message that life continued elsewhere, that human events were not entirely suspended by their captivity, and that the larger arc of history might one day intersect with their own lives. In a space designed to erase individuality, autonomy, and connection, the possibility of external change offered a psychological tether to a reality larger than the wire, frost, labor, and disease. Ultimately, the whispers of change exemplified the precariousness of hope in captivity. They were fragile, mutable, and capable of generating both strength and despair. They illuminated the tension between desire and fear, between belief and skepticism, and between anticipation and disappointment. Within the camp's oppressive architecture, these rumors became small, vital disruptions of monotony and dehumanization, sparks of potential life and agency that could, if carefully nurtured, sustain prisoners' endurance through the relentless machinery of deprivation. The approach of liberation was neither sudden nor universally evident. It unfolded as a subtle, uneven, and almost imperceptible transformation across the network of camps. The first signs were slight, often dismissed at first: a guard who appeared less vigilant, a ration delivery delayed or simplified, the absence of a familiar officer on inspection rounds, or the faint, distant rumble of artillery that could not be confirmed. These small deviations from established patterns produced a mix of anticipation and unease. Prisoners, trained to endure monotony and cruelty, could not easily interpret these changes. Every subtle variation was scrutinized, analyzed, and weighed for potential consequence, producing a heightened state of tension that combined the familiar rhythms of fear and labor with the foreign possibility of imminent change. The soundscape of liberation was diffuse and ambiguous. Artillery from distant fronts, once merely a reminder of a world beyond, now suggested progress, advancement, or retreat. The occasional absence of guards introduced a paradoxical combination of opportunity and anxiety. The spaces normally patrolled and regulated by authority became simultaneously inviting and threatening. Every movement, every decision, every glance was refracted through the lens of cautious expectation. Men had learned that the machinery of survival depended not on conjecture but on observation and adaptation, yet they could not fully prepare for the arrival of freedom, an event for which the mind had no prior schema. In these final nights before liberation, time seemed simultaneously accelerated and suspended. The labor fields, once measured only in effort and repetition, were now observed for signs of change: the presence or absence of a guard, the unusual silence between commands, the subtle movement of equipment. Even the barracks previously fixed in routine became sites of heightened awareness. Prisoners lay awake in thin straw bedding, ears straining for any shift in sound, eyes trained on shadows cast by moonlight through narrow windows or over frost-laden floors. Sleep became a fragmented, shallow refuge, interrupted by anticipation, memory, and anxiety. Each hour was both ordinary and extraordinary, mundane in activity, but charged with the latent potential of freedom. The physical landscape of the camp also reflected the gradual approach of liberation. Roads that had been meticulously patrolled were suddenly quieter. Woods and fields adjacent to the wire fences appeared less threatening, as some guards vanished into the shadows, abandoning posts or retreating to positions farther from the prisoners' observation. Small openings in routine were noticed, catalogued, and interpreted. Even the smallest disruptions became magnified, each a potential harbinger of the profound transformation that lay ahead. Men observed, waited, and calculated, blending learned discipline with the fragile hope that the patterns of captivity were finally loosening. The psychology of these days was complex. The prisoners' mental reserves, conditioned by years of monotony, deprivation, and suffering, were now tested by a novel and uncertain variable: the imminence of liberation. Hope, long tempered by rumor, memory, and imagination, was now engaged in concrete anticipation. Men rehearsed actions in their minds, stepping beyond the barracks, moving through labor fields unobserved, reclaiming clothing and belongings, and confronting the first moments of freedom. These mental rehearsals were layered atop the continuous vigilance required by survival. The mind now had to navigate both the expected pressures of labor and observation, and the uncharted emotional landscape of impending liberation. Even the social fabric of the camp shifted subtly in these final nights. Companions who had relied on silent gestures, shared glances, and the covert exchange of rational warmth now communicated with heightened awareness of both danger and possibility. Collective observation of change, whispered speculation about distant events, and mutual reinforcement of hope became central to endurance. The bonds that had been nurtured through years of deprivation were now enlisted in the delicate task of navigating anticipation, preserving composure, and sustaining morale. Each prisoner's awareness of another's emotional state contributed to a shared rhythm of readiness, patience, and careful optimism. The bodily effects of long-term captivity remained evident even as liberation approached. Frostbite, malnutrition, illness, and the cumulative toll of labor and psychological stress left men weakened, fragile, and painfully aware of vulnerability. The approach of freedom did not erase these corporeal realities, rather it amplified them. The body, accustomed to repetitive exertion and deprivation, now experienced the dissonance of expectation. The possibility of restoration existed, yet the physical form remained constrained by years of systematic erosion. Every movement, stretch, or effort was infused with both hope and caution, as men balanced the desire to act with the persistent awareness of fragility. The ambient sounds of the camp assumed new significance. The low murmur of prisoners, the scraping of boots on frost-hardened paths, the distant clatter of supply or labor, and the subtle, almost imperceptible shifts in guard activity were interpreted with heightened attentiveness. Men became experts in auditory discrimination, identifying signals that might indicate a broader pattern of change. Each noise was catalogued, cross-referenced, and mentally rehearsed for response. The mind's capacity to anticipate and adapt, honed over years of captivity, was now engaged in a novel domain: the recognition and navigation of the slow approach of liberation. The nights preceding liberation were also filled with the residue of accumulated memory and imagination. Prisoners revisited recollections of home, family, past meals and landscapes in the mind's theater, overlaying them with rehearsed scenarios of freedom. Imagination became both rehearsal and refuge, blending expectation with anticipation, memory with projection. These mental constructs provided both comfort and strategy, preparing men psychologically for the eventuality that would soon perhaps be realized in physical terms. Even amid exhaustion and physical deterioration, the mind found energy to sustain these complex simulations, drawing strength from the vision of a world beyond the wire. Yet the approach of liberation was never entirely linear or predictable. Some camps received conflicting signals, rumors of advancing forces, contradicted by continued harsh enforcement, partial retreats of guards, offset by sudden inspections, distant sounds of battle tempered by silence in adjacent sectors. The prisoners learned to tolerate ambiguity, balancing engagement with hope against the constant risk of disillusionment. The anticipation of freedom required a novel form of endurance, patience not simply in the sense of survival, but in the regulation of emotion, expectation, and interpersonal behavior, as the external world began to shift in ways both observable and subtle. Memory and imagination now intersected with external reality in profound ways, scenes rehearsed internally, the steps beyond barracks, the reclaiming of warmth, the resumption of self-directed action were poised to intersect with tangible experience. The mind, trained for survival and adaptation, now confronted the uncertainty of translating internal expectation into physical action. Each prisoner navigated the delicate balance between cautious engagement with present conditions and preparatory mental projection into imminent liberation. This interplay created a complex temporal landscape in which past, present, and potential future coexisted and informed one another in sustained psychological negotiation. The relational dynamics of the camp, long defined by silent cooperation, subtle gestures, and minimal exchanges of trust, now acquired an additional dimension. Companions became co-negotiators of anticipation, coordinating responses to changing circumstances, monitoring the behaviors of guards, and sharing fragments of information. Trust, previously exercised primarily in survival contexts, now encompassed the interpretation of emergent signals and collective preparation for eventual release. These interpersonal interactions were cautious, measured, and silent, reflecting both the training of years in captivity and the novelty of the emerging reality, the first faint stirrings of freedom. Sleep, which had previously functioned as both refuge and ritualized repetition, was now heavily modulated by anticipation. Men drifted in and out of shallow rest, dreams blending past experience, current observation, and imagined freedom. Sleep itself became a rehearsal, a mental and physical preparation for action, while also serving as temporary relief from the sustained tension of vigilance. Night and day merged into a continuum of waiting, observing, imagining, and cautiously hoping. The approach of liberation also illuminated the physical and psychological toll of captivity. Frostbite, malnutrition, illness, and the cumulative strain of forced labor remained tangible and immediate. Each step beyond the barracks, each attempt at movement, was calibrated against the awareness of bodily limitation. Yet these constraints were reframed by the emerging reality of liberation. Weakness and fatigue were now perceived as temporary obstacles, to be negotiated in the service of approaching freedom. The juxtaposition of vulnerability and possibility created a profound tension in consciousness, underscoring both fragility and resilience. As the final night stretched onward, the prisoner's perception of time became fluid, combining the elongated monotony of years of captivity with the compressed urgency of anticipated change. Every sound, shadow, and movement was imbued with layered significance. A footstep could indicate guard retreat, a distant rumble might signal approaching forces, a shift in routine might herald transformation. The mind parsed these signals carefully, balancing the lessons of experience against the hope for liberation, and preparing, in small increments, for the eventual convergence of expectation and reality. Even minor successes, such as the absence of a particular guard, a less demanding labor assignment, or the discovery of slightly improved rations, were magnified in psychological impact. Each represented a tangible, if small, manifestation of change, reinforcing anticipation and subtly validating hope. In this environment, the interplay between perception, expectation, and reality was heightened to an extreme, producing a mental state that was simultaneously tense, alert, reflective, and cautiously optimistic. The liberation that approached was thus experienced not as a singular event, but as a protracted, multidimensional process. It was perceived through sound, observation, memory, imagination, and interpersonal cues, blending the external world with the interior experience of anticipation and hope. Men existed in a liminal space. The machinery of captivity remained operative, yet the first hints of freedom flickered within perception, subtly, unevenly distributed. Each day, each hour, each observation carried the potential for profound transformation, yet also the persistent risk of disappointment. In the stillness, in the tension, and in the cautious observation of change, the prisoners confronted the paradox of liberation. It was near, yet not fully realized, imminent, yet delayed, tangible in signal, yet abstract in its arrival. Their endurance was measured not only by labor, hunger, cold, and observation, but by the capacity to sustain hope, navigate uncertainty, and preserve composure in the liminal space between captivity and freedom. The moment the gates opened arrived with a quiet, almost surreal weight, far removed from the explosive triumphs imagined in dreams or whispered in rumors. The prisoners, long habituated to the narrow, oppressive confines of barbed wire, frost, and shadowed barracks, stepped cautiously into a world that seemed simultaneously familiar and alien. The air itself appeared different, lighter, colder in the sense of real exposure, yet unbound by fences, steps, or watchtowers. Every inhalation carried an unfamiliar sense of possibility, tinged with disbelief. The sky stretched wider than they had remembered, clouds drifting unobserved by sentries, sunlight spilling freely across the frozen ground, and the distant sounds of life, birds, wind, and distant human activity, reached them without filtering through the structured, oppressive environment of captivity. Each sensory impression was amplified by its rarity, producing a disorientation that was almost as profound as the years of confinement that preceded it. Bodies long weakened by malnutrition, frostbite, labor, and disease now had to negotiate a terrain that was physically unbounded but emotionally constricted. Movements were uncertain, legs, shoulders, and hands that had adapted to repetitive labor and cramped barracks spaces hesitated when confronted with freedom of motion. Some prisoners stumbled as they emerged, unsure how to pace themselves or how to inhabit space unmediated by fences or commands. Muscles protested, weakened and fragile, yet the mind insisted on movement. Each step was both literal and symbolic, a navigation of the physical realm, and simultaneously, a tentative reclamation of agency over a body that had long been subordinated to the imperatives of survival and external control. The landscape beyond the fences offered both relief and estrangement. Trees that had been glimpsed only in memory now swayed in real wind. Roads extended into open horizons rather than terminating in gates or guard towers, and the textures of snow, earth, and stone, once interpreted through the lens of deprivation and labor, now demanded full attention. Every footfall and gesture carried a duality, familiar in appearance yet charged with novelty and the implications of unstructured space. The mind struggled to reconcile its long-conditioned sense of confinement with the tangible reality of openness, creating a surreal blend of wonder, fear, and disbelief. Even as freedom manifested in the physical sense, the mental and emotional constraints of captivity remained. Memory and imagination, forged over years of retreat into the mind, interwove with the present moment. Every sound of artillery in the distance, every sight of abandoned posts or scattered remnants of camp infrastructure invoked recollection, the barbed wire, the frost, the labor, the beatings, and the hunger. The freedom of space did not erase the shadows imprinted on body and mind. Rather, it created a layered experience in which liberation existed alongside the enduring imprint of suffering. Prisoners were free in the external, observable world, yet the interior landscapes of trauma, memory, and adaptation persisted, shaping perception, movement, and emotional response. The first encounters with open air also revealed the subtle persistence of camp-conditioned behavior. Men instinctively moved in cautious groups, scanning the horizon as though expecting guards or sudden orders. Hands brushed against companions for reassurance, bodies aligned in silent coordination. Eyes remained alert for threat. Even the seemingly limitless expanse was filtered through a mindset honed for surveillance, anticipation, and the avoidance of punishment. Freedom was not immediately intuitive. It required the unlearning of patterns established over years, even as the exhilaration of unbound movement unfolded. Sensory perception was heightened to an almost overwhelming degree. The smell of earth, the crispness of winter air, the tactile feedback of snow underfoot, the distant call of birds, and the murmur of rivers or wind through the landscape were experienced with a clarity that the camp had systematically denied. Each element was absorbed not merely as physical data, but as a symbolic confirmation of a world beyond constraint. Colors appeared sharper, sounds richer, textures more nuanced. The full spectrum of experience, long muted by the monotony and deprivation of imprisonment, returned in vivid intensity, almost overwhelming the frail bodies and minds encountering them for the first time in years. The emotional dimension of this emergence was equally complex. Relief, disbelief, and elation intermingled with exhaustion, fear, and uncertainty. Prisoners felt joy in motion, delight in perception, and the almost childlike wonder of autonomy. But these were tempered by the latent knowledge of vulnerability. Bodies remained thin, malnourished, and physically compromised. The risk of injury, infection, or collapse persisted. The juxtaposition of newfound liberty and lingering fragility produced a strange, almost hypnotic calm, a slow, reflective processing of what freedom meant not just as movement, but as lived experience. Memory continued to shadow perception. Every step beyond the wire was measured against recollections of the camp's routines, punishments, and labor. Snow, which now blanketed open fields and forests, was read simultaneously as winter wonder and as the frost of barracks floors. The sounds of wind, once ignored or feared, became signals of freedom, but also recalled the gusts that had swept across labor fields and exhausted bodies. Taste and smell, previously constrained by meager rations, were now reinvigorated, yet each sensation carried subtle undertones of scarcity and past deprivation. Freedom was present, yet inseparable from the sediment of experience accumulated during years of captivity. The social dimension of the first steps beyond wire was striking in its quiet intensity. Companions who had shared silent gestures, furtive glances, and small acts of mutual care now moved together through the open space, communicating not in words but in posture, timing, and synchronized movement. Trust, hard-earned in the constricted conditions of labor and deprivation, guided proximity, coordination, and navigation. Each gesture reinforced relational bonds and created a collective rhythm that provided stability in a moment that was both disorienting and profoundly liberating. The mind's retreat, cultivated during years of forced introspection and imagination, now found an external substrate. Landscapes, sounds, and textures provided new dimensions for exploration, allowing the mind to exercise creativity, curiosity, and engagement beyond the purely survival-oriented processes it had maintained within barracks and labor fields. Mental rehearsal and memory merged with observation, creating a composite experience in which freedom was both realized and interpreted, simultaneously external and internal. The prisoner's inner landscapes found reflection, expansion, and grounding in the tangible environment. Despite the novelty of open space, caution persisted. The mind instinctively scanned for potential threats, patterns of control, or residual authority. Guards' absence did not immediately translate into safety. Instinct and habit continued to govern movement, posture, and attention. Yet each cautious step forward reinforced autonomy and agency, gradually recalibrating the body and mind to freedom. The very act of walking without constraint, choosing direction, and inhabiting space at will became a slow and deliberate practice of reclamation, an exercise in regaining mastery over self and circumstance. The surreal calm of liberation contrasted sharply with the intensity of anticipation cultivated over years. There were no grand celebrations, no immediate transformations, only the quiet observation of freedom realized. Each prisoner experienced liberation in a deeply personal way, a combination of awe, relief, fragility, and introspection. The air, the light, the expanse of landscape, and the absence of fences were acknowledged not only physically but emotionally and psychologically. Freedom was tangible, yet subdued, experienced as a profound shift in context rather than explosive release. The persistence of memory ensured that liberation did not erase captivity. The trauma of deprivation, cruelty, frost, hunger, and forced labor remained embedded in posture, gait, perception, and emotional response. Even in the absence of barbed wire, the mind and body continued to navigate patterns shaped by survival, conditioning, and adaptation. Every step into the open was therefore an act of reconciliation, integrating memory with reality, endurance with autonomy, and years of trauma with the present experience of freedom. In this sense, the first steps beyond wire were both arrival and continuation. They marked the end of immediate physical captivity, yet also the beginning of a prolonged engagement with memory, recovery, and the complex reconciliation of identity and experience. Liberation was a threshold, not a destination. It demanded observation, recalibration, and patience. Men were free, yet freedom itself required time, care, and reflection to inhabit fully. Even after the gates had opened and bodies moved into open air, the true work of survival continued in a subtler, quieter, and more insidious form. The prisoners, now technically free, were immediately confronted by the aftermath of captivity: emaciated bodies, frostbitten extremities, weakened hearts, and immune systems ravaged by years of malnutrition and disease. Hospitals and makeshift medical centers became the first point of transition, places where survival could be recalibrated, but where the enormity of bodily deterioration could not be ignored. Staff moved with urgent efficiency, tending to wounds, administering medicine, providing nutrition, and stabilizing the most fragile lives. Yet even in these spaces of care, the psychological residue of imprisonment remained omnipresent. Each sensory impression, the smell of antiseptic, the metallic tang of blood, the texture of bandages, acted as both relief and reminder, an echo of the countless hours in which the body had been both object and instrument of suffering. Refugee centers offered a different kind of confrontation. Freed prisoners were gathered, processed, and documented, their identities restored in bureaucratic terms but still fractured in human terms. The collective relief was punctuated by an overwhelming disorientation: faces of strangers, loud conversations, clattering utensils, and the general noise of organized human activity produced both relief and stress. Survivors had lived for years within a regimented, muted soundscape, and the sudden reintroduction to the chaos of ordinary life created moments of panic, unease, and vulnerability. Even the simplest activities, walking down a corridor, eating a full meal, listening to a conversation, required recalibration, as reflexes honed for observation and survival during captivity persisted, unbidden and unrelenting. Homecomings, when they occurred, often felt unreal. Survivors returned to landscapes and communities that had endured the war, but had moved on, leaving temporal dislocations between expectation and reality. Streets looked familiar yet distorted by the lens of memory and trauma. Homes were often occupied differently, reconstructed or scarred by war. Families, while joyous and relieved, could not fully bridge the gap between lived experience and remembered or imagined life. The returning individual carried within them the persistent imprint of captivity, the chronic awareness of scarcity, the mental rehearsal of threat, the internalization of vigilance. Emotional responses were muted or complicated, as grief, relief, joy, and residual fear intertwined in unpredictable ways. The psychological echoes of camp life persisted long after liberation. The sound of chains, once physical and immediate, returned in dreams and intrusive thoughts. Nights were haunted by the rhythm of roll calls, labor and patrols, replaying with the precision of memory and the exaggeration of imagination. A sudden shout, the clatter of a dropped object, or a perceived shift in light or shadow could trigger reflexive fear, the body responding before conscious thought could intervene. These involuntary responses illustrated the depth of imprint left by years of systematic control, deprivation, and trauma. Sensory memory, in particular, shaped the survivor's experience. The smell of smoke, the scent of damp wood, the metallic tang of blood, or the acrid odor of excrement became embedded in memory, resurfacing unexpectedly and bringing with it the emotional resonance of past suffering. Taste and texture was similarly evocative. Certain foods, smells, or surfaces could trigger flashbacks or visceral recollections, merging past deprivation with present experience. The mind, conditioned to interpret sensory data as a matter of survival, remained hyper-vigilant, translating ordinary stimuli into signals that could provoke fear, anxiety, or an acute awareness of vulnerability. The body, long accustomed to extremes of scarcity, cold, and forced labor, now struggled with excess and novelty. Nutrition, warmth, and rest were suddenly available, but the body required careful rehabilitation. Muscles, bones, and internal organs, weakened by years of stress, needed gradual reintroduction to activity and nourishment. Food, which had once been a source of obsessive thought and fantasy, now became both sustenance and challenge, as the digestive system struggled to process rich quantities after prolonged deprivation. Even simple movements, like standing for extended periods or walking across open terrain, became exercises in adaptation, testing endurance and resilience in ways that the mind and body had not anticipated. Social reintegration presented additional challenges. Prisoners returned to societies that had survived under occupation, war, and disruption, and interpersonal dynamics were often complex. Survivors carried both the intimacy of bonds forged in the extreme conditions of captivity and the emotional weight of isolation from their pre-war communities. Shared experiences in the camp could create intense, immediate camaraderie, yet these relationships often existed outside traditional social frameworks. Survivors had to navigate the tension between the intense, distilled connections of captivity and the broader, more diffuse relationships of civilian life. Even as survivors encountered care, nourishment, and social reconnection, the internalized mechanisms of survival persisted. Habits of observation, silent coordination, and anticipation of threat had been honed over years, and were not easily relinquished. These reflexes, once essential for physical safety, now became psychological artifacts, shaping interactions, attention, and emotional regulation. Memory and trauma intertwined with perception in ways that subtly distorted the experience of everyday life, producing a dissonance between external freedom and internal constraint. The process of emotional reconciliation was uneven. Joy, relief, and gratitude existed alongside lingering fear, guilt, and sorrow. Survivors frequently experienced survivor's guilt, the acute awareness that others, sometimes close companions, had perished under conditions equally extreme. Mourning, therefore, was complicated by the necessity of rebuilding life, reconstructing community, and re-establishing daily routines. The simultaneous presence of grief and relief created a layered emotional landscape, one in which freedom could be experienced without entirely erasing the memory of captivity. Psychological coping often relied on both conscious and unconscious mechanisms. Rituals of self-care, habitual routines, and the reinforcement of physical activity served as anchors. Mental rehearsal, long practiced in captivity as a means of survival, now functioned to integrate experience, interpret trauma, and envision a reconstructed future. Memory and imagination continued to serve as tools for endurance, helping to manage the tension between the enduring presence of past suffering and the immediate demands of physical and social reintegration. Even in moments of ordinary life, walking through a familiar street, eating a warm meal, sleeping in a comfortable bed, the imprint of the camp remained. Reflexes conditioned by years of deprivation, vigilance, and constrained movement persisted, reminding survivors that liberation was a transition, not an instantaneous transformation. The body and mind required time, care, and sustained attention to reconcile the accumulated burden of trauma with the possibilities of ordinary existence. In this liminal state between captivity and full reintegration, survivors were often acutely aware of the paradoxical nature of their existence. They were physically free, yet psychologically constrained, surrounded by abundance, yet conditioned by scarcity, immersed in community, yet carrying the internalized patterns of isolation and silence. The experience of liberation was thus inseparable from the persistence of memory. Every sensory impression, every emotional response, and every interpersonal interaction was filtered through the lens of accumulated trauma, shaping perception and behavior in profound ways. Recovery, both physical and psychological, unfolded gradually, demanding patience and adaptation. Hospitals and medical centers provided immediate stabilization, but full restoration of bodily strength required months or years. Psychological rehabilitation was less tangible, unfolding in fragmented increments as survivors processed memory, re-established trust, and recalibrated emotional responses. Rituals, structured routines, and social connections became crucial scaffolding, providing stability while facilitating integration into a world that had endured and evolved in parallel to the survivor's own experience. The soundscape of life beyond the camp also demanded attention. Ordinary noises, streetcars, machinery, children playing, could trigger heightened vigilance, while familiar sounds from memory elicited comfort or distress. The auditory world became a site of negotiation, where survivors had to distinguish between present safety and the echoes of past threat. The body's reflexive responses, shaped by years of survival conditioning, remained alert to stimuli long after the immediate danger had passed, requiring conscious effort to reframe perception and rebuild confidence. Through all of this, memory acted as both burden and guide. The recollection of camp routines, labor, hunger, frost, disease, and cruelty informed caution, survival instincts, and resilience. Simultaneously, memory provided a framework for understanding, contextualizing, and eventually integrating the experience of captivity into a broader narrative of life. The interplay between memory, perception, and action created a delicate balance. The past informed the present, yet the present demanded adaptation, care, and the construction of new patterns of thought, behavior, and emotion. Ultimately, the aftermath of liberation revealed the profound truth that freedom, while physical, could not instantaneously erase years of deprivation and trauma. Hospitals, refugee centers, and homecomings offered care and reconnection, yet survivors carried the camp within them. The sound of chains, the smell of smoke, the reflex of fear at sudden noise, the rigid patterns of observation and vigilance, all persisted as echoes of the past. Liberation marked the end of captivity, but it also inaugurated a prolonged journey of recovery, reconciliation, and reintegration. Freedom was both relief and challenge, an opportunity to reclaim life while acknowledging and accommodating the persistent presence of the past. Even as liberation unfolded, and the first survivors stepped beyond barbed wire into open air, a profound absence shadowed every step. Not all who had endured captivity emerged to reclaim life. Countless others had succumbed to hunger, disease, overwork, or systematic cruelty. Some perished quietly in overcrowded barracks or on labor fields, their deaths recorded only in fragments of camp logs or lost altogether. Others were swept away in hurried transports, buried in unmarked graves, or discarded into the chaos of retreat and collapse, leaving no trace of identity beyond a number tattooed, a tally noted, or the fading memory of a companion. These vanished souls became the unseen population of the camps, the invisible, the erased, the permanently silenced. The narrative of survival, while compelling and immediate, must confront this absence. For the liberation of some cannot fully exonerate the machinery that destroyed others. Every reclaimed body, every returned survivor, carried with them an imprint of those who did not return. Memory itself became a conduit for recognition, a glance at a vacant bunk, a space once occupied by a friend who had perished. The absence of a familiar cough in the barracks, the silence that settled over labor fields where men had once staggered under frost and fatigue. Each small observation was charged with the weight of omission, a reminder that survival itself is selective and often arbitrary, bound by circumstance, timing, and the unforgiving arithmetic of mortality. The unmarked graves, dispersed across landscapes scarred by war, became both literal and symbolic monuments. Buried in forests, fields, or hastily dug pits, these sites preserved nothing more than earth pressed over human remains, yet their presence carried an enduring testimony. The absence of names, dates, or markers transformed silence into its own form of memorialization. The very invisibility of these individuals imposed a weight on the living. Their stories, though unrecorded, demanded acknowledgement through reflection, memory, and witness. Survivors carried these silent testimonies in subtle, persistent ways, in gestures of remembrance, in the avoidance of certain sights, in the retelling of incomplete stories, in the quiet acknowledgement of absence during moments of liberation and reunion. The psychological weight of this selective survival was profound. Survivors experienced not only relief and joy at being alive, but also guilt, sorrow, and a sense of incompleteness. The knowledge that comrades had vanished, erased by circumstance or death, produced a persistent moral and emotional tension. How could one reconcile the euphoria of survival with the reality of absence? How could one reclaim life while holding in memory the faces, names, and identities of those obliterated? These questions, often unanswerable, became integral to the long-term process of psychological recovery. Memory, narrative, and silence intertwined, providing the architecture through which survivors could acknowledge absence without being consumed by it. Even the very act of speaking became a challenge. Names of the deceased were sometimes forgotten, distorted, or impossible to retrieve. Stories, recounted in barracks or among small groups of survivors, often relied on fragmentary recollection, conjecture, and the extrapolation of others' experiences. The gaps in memory created a space in which silence itself spoke, a pause that communicated absence, a blank line in a ledger, an empty chair in a communal space. This silence was not emptiness but presence, a witness to what had been taken, an acknowledgement that history itself could be incomplete, partial, and incapable of full restitution. Physical landscapes, too, bore the imprint of those who had vanished. Forests, fields, riverbanks, and mine shafts became sites of unrecorded death. Survivors walking across liberated terrain could sense the layers of loss embedded in the land, the places where bodies had lain, where labor had crushed life, where frost and disease had claimed individuals, and where the indifferent machinery of war had rendered human existence invisible. These landscapes functioned as silent memorials, refusing the narrative of total liberation, insisting instead on the persistence of absence alongside presence. The vanished population also shaped communal memory. Survivors, in the process of reintegration, often preserved these absent identities through rituals, storytelling, and reflection. The act of remembrance could take subtle forms, leaving a place vacant, whispering a name during shared meals, observing moments of silence, or noting the absence of someone during conversation. These practices preserved the ethical and emotional integrity of survival, transforming absence into witness and memory into a living monument. Silence paradoxically became both a burden and a vessel for respect, demanding the attention of those who remained while acknowledging that restoration could never be complete. Time, in this context, functioned unevenly. While the living could return to routines, re-establish relationships, and reconstruct daily life, the erased could not. Generations of memory were disrupted. Families were left without closure, friends without finality, and communities with gaps that could never be fully bridged. The persistence of absence created a temporal dissonance. The living moved forward, yet the dead remained suspended, their existence registered only through implication, imagination, and intermittent acknowledgement. Liberation, therefore, existed in parallel with loss, and freedom could never fully disentangle itself from the continuum of absence that defined the human cost of captivity. The psychological impact of these forgotten ones was evident in subtle behaviors among survivors. A shared glance at a vacant bunk, a momentary pause at the sight of a mass grave, or an instinctive hesitation when walking through a field all reflected the embodied awareness of absence. Survivors carried this knowledge in posture, gaze, speech, and movement, as memory of the disappeared mediated the perception of space and time. The experience of life, even after liberation, was inseparable from the shadow of those who could not continue the journey. Moreover, the vanished left an enduring imprint on collective historical consciousness. Official records, camp logs, and post-war accounts often overlooked or minimized the presence of the unrecorded, rendering the forgotten ones invisible to conventional narratives. Yet their erasure was counterbalanced by the lived testimony of survivors, the subtle traces left in landscapes, and the silent practices of remembrance. History in this sense was both written and unwritten, composed of presence and absence, and sustained by the ongoing engagement of those who had witnessed what the machinery of war sought to erase. Ethically and emotionally, acknowledging the forgotten ones demanded a shift in perspective. Survival could no longer be understood purely as an individual achievement. It required recognition of relational loss, the arbitrariness of endurance, and the moral responsibility of memory. Acts of commemoration, personal reflection, and the preservation of stories, however fragmentary, became essential practices for integrating liberation with historical consciousness. The silent monument of absence, constructed through thought, witness, and reflection, asserted itself as a persistent presence in the psyche of the survivors and in the moral landscape of post-war humanity. Even years later, survivors recalled the vanished in ways that transcended conventional remembrance. A passing shadow, the sudden cry of a bird, the smell of smoke, or the texture of frost might evoke the memory of those erased from records. Such moments were neither purely nostalgic nor entirely mournful. They functioned as continuous acts of recognition, bridging temporal and spatial gaps, allowing the living to sustain a form of communion with the absent. The presence of the forgotten became inseparable from the process of living, shaping perception, emotional response, and the narrative of recovery. In this way, liberation and absence coexisted in a fragile and intricate balance. Freed bodies moved through space, breathing air once denied, stepping into sunlight once obscured, and reclaiming agency over motion and choice. Yet the shadow of the vanished accompanied every step, creating a liminal space in which joy, relief, and wonder were constantly tempered by memory, recognition, and grief. The silence of the unrecorded became a counterpoint to the noise of return, a persistent reminder of the human cost that underlay every moment of freedom. Ultimately, the forgotten ones were memorialized not in stone or inscription, but in the living memory and ongoing experience of the survivors. Silence itself became a vessel for recognition, an ethical acknowledgement, and a profound witness. Their erasure from official record did not erase their impact, rather it transformed the act of remembering into a continuous conscious engagement, requiring the living to carry the weight of their absence with attention, care, and respect. In this quiet and sustained attention, the memory of the unrecorded was preserved as a moral and emotional monument that neither time nor liberation could diminish. Decades have passed since the gates of the camps opened and the prisoners first stepped into the wide, unbounded air beyond barbed wire. The world has moved on, cities rebuilt, families grew, technologies advanced, and nations reshaped themselves in ways unimaginable to those who once occupied the frozen barracks and labor fields. Yet the physical traces of the camps, though largely abandoned, remain as ghostly reminders of suffering: shattered barracks slowly succumbing to rot, rusted wire curling over once frozen ground, watchtowers leaning against the relentless pull of time. Nature, indifferent yet persistent, reclaims the terrain with quiet determination. Grasses push through the frost-hardened soil, trees extend their roots through cracked foundations, moss and lichen cover the scorched earth where once men toiled and perished. The silence is profound but not empty. It is the lingering voice of history, a soft but unyielding witness to what occurred inscribed upon the land itself. Memory, however, persists in a far less tangible but infinitely more enduring form. Those who survived carry within them the invisible architecture of the camps, etched not in stone or metal but in consciousness. The experiences of deprivation, labor, cruelty, and endurance form an intricate web of recollection that shapes perception, decision-making, and emotional understanding for the remainder of a lifetime. These memories are neither static nor stagnant, they ebb and flow, sometimes dormant for decades, only to re-emerge with the smell of smoke, the texture of frost, the distant clatter of labor, or the sound of chains imagined in the mind's ear. Memory in this sense is a living entity, simultaneously personal and collective, an ongoing engagement with the past that both informs the present and guards against the forgetting of human capacity for both cruelty and endurance. The survivors, and the generations that follow them, carry forward the lessons of this endurance. These are not lessons born of triumphalism or anger, but of reflection and witness, an acknowledgement of the fragility of human life, the vulnerability of societal and moral structures under stress, and the remarkable resilience that allows individuals to endure extreme deprivation and cruelty. The camps, now ruins, and the absent, unrecorded dead, serve as anchors for ethical reflection, demanding that remembrance not merely exist as nostalgia or horror, but as an active engagement with human responsibility. The quiet insistence of memory shapes behavior, informs historical consciousness, and cultivates vigilance against repetition of such atrocities. Time, which has softened the contours of physical suffering, cannot soften the moral imperatives imposed by memory. The barbed wire may decay, the barracks may collapse, and frost may retreat with changing climates, yet the psychological, emotional, and ethical imprint remains. Stories passed down from survivors to children, grandchildren, and communities form a chain of witness, a tapestry woven from lived experience and deliberate reflection. Each retelling reinforces the presence of memory within the social consciousness, bridging decades and reminding new generations that the endurance of human beings under extreme conditions is both testament and warning. The persistence of memory ensures that the suffering endured is not erased by the passage of time, even as the physical world inevitably shifts and reclaims itself. The quiet reclamation of the camps by nature creates an atmosphere of both closure and continuity. Where soldiers once shivered in frost, grasses now sway in wind unbroken. Where laborers toiled under watchful eyes, moss softens the once harrowed soil. Yet the presence of absence, of what was lost, persists. Abandoned graves, eroded foundations, and rusted implements carry their own testimony. A subtle insistence that the human stories contained within these spaces are neither complete nor erasable. The silent landscapes resonate with echoes of endurance and absence alike, offering a meditative space where one can confront the full dimensions of captivity, suffering, and human resilience. Memory in the survivor's consciousness often manifests in quiet, almost imperceptible ways. A fleeting hesitation at the sound of a chain, a reflexive adjustment in posture at the sound of a shouted command, a recollection of ration lines or frost-bitten nights. These echoes are neither pathological nor intended to impede life, but they are persistent, integrating past experience into the ongoing rhythm of existence. Memory in this way is a living archive, simultaneously protective, instructive, and honoring of those who did not survive. It shapes ethical sensibilities and fosters empathy, allowing the endurance of one generation to illuminate the moral landscape for the next. The story of endurance also encompasses the forgotten, the erased, the ones whose names were never recorded. Their absence, while silent, shapes memory in ways both profound and subtle. In the quiet observation of ruins, the careful reflection on historical records, and the deliberate practice of remembrance, these lost individuals continue to assert presence. Silence becomes an ethical and narrative vessel, transforming absence into acknowledgement. The persistence of memory is inseparable from the recognition of these vanished lives, ensuring that the incompleteness of historical record does not translate into the erasure of moral responsibility. Freedom, achieved after so many years of suffering, does not diminish memory but reframes it. Survivors navigate life carrying both the experience of liberation and the imprint of captivity. Even in moments of ordinary daily life, the sensory, emotional, and psychological legacies of the camps persist. The rustle of leaves in the wind, the crunch of snow beneath a footstep, the taste of a meal once scarce, all evoke subtle reminders of past endurance, shaping awareness and grounding moral reflection. Memory is thus both anchor and compass, tethering individuals to history while guiding ethical and emotional behavior in the present. Historical consciousness, enriched by survivor testimony, remains crucial. The ruins of camps, photographs, oral histories, diaries, and the preserved artifacts of daily suffering form an interwoven network of evidence that resists erasure. These remnants encourage reflection not only on the capacity for human cruelty, but also on the resilience, dignity, and solidarity that emerge under extreme oppression. Memory becomes a means of ethical vigilance, a reminder that the endurance of human beings is both remarkable and fragile, and that the structures enabling dehumanization must never be allowed to persist unchecked. Decades hence, the story insists upon a form of remembrance that is active rather than passive. It is not enough to acknowledge the past, one must engage with it through reflection, witness, and moral consciousness. Memory persists as a bridge between past suffering and contemporary ethical responsibility, ensuring that the experiences of those who endured, and those who were erased, inform the values, decisions, and actions of subsequent generations. The quiet insistence of remembrance becomes both a monument and a safeguard, cultivating understanding, empathy, and vigilance in perpetuity. In this reflective space, anger or vengeance is neither necessary nor productive. The narrative's focus rests on endurance, witness, and moral attention. The camp's ruins, the absent dead, and the survivors' memories collectively offer testimony to the human capacity for suffering, endurance, and resilience. They call for a deliberate, conscientious engagement with history that prioritizes understanding, reflection, and ethical vigilance over spectacle or sensationalism. The lessons embedded in memory are timeless, transcending individual lifespans and asserting the continuity of human responsibility across generations. The story concludes not with noise or dramatic flourish, but with quiet remembrance, the acknowledgement that humanity is capable of both extraordinary cruelty and extraordinary endurance. The grass growing through barbed wire, the collapsing barracks, and the rusting implements form a visual metaphor for resilience, reclamation, and the persistence of life. Memory endures in silence, in witness, and in the conscious act of recognition. It sustains both the moral and emotional continuity of human experience, insisting that what was endured should never be forgotten, and that the lessons of history remain present to guide all who follow. Through this enduring reflection, the camps live on not as active sites of suffering, but as spaces of remembrance. They remind the world that human beings can endure immense hardship, yet also caution that vigilance, empathy, and moral attention are necessary to ensure that such suffering is never repeated. The quiet persistence of memory becomes both monument and lesson, affirming the resilience of spirit, the weight of absence, and the unbroken obligation to witness, remember, and act responsibly in the world that follows.